Hello again and welcome to another Morty and Glory Warhammer 40k video. In today's episode we are going to be doing another tournament after action report. That's right, it's time for some more dispatches from the front lines. And let me tell you guys, I am incredibly excited to do today's video because this event was the most fun I have ever had at a tournament, hands down. I know that is an incredibly bold statement to make, but it's true, guys, and it's all because I was finally running something I've wanted to do for literally years. I took a combat guard army into a competitive shark tank, and it led to so many epic moments in every single game. I don't want to give too much away, guys, but I can't help it. I want to get you guys hyped for this video. Colonel Iron Hand Straken got into a 1v1 fight with Khan the Betrayer, Calidor Drago and Trajan Valoris over the course of this event, and Sly Marbo himself went toe-to-toe with Angron, the new Demon Primarch of the World Eaters. And with all of that to look forward to, let's crack on with today's video and dive right into this. As is tradition, before we dive into the games, guys, I'd briefly like to say a quick thank you to the venue and the tournament organisers for putting together a fantastic event. The event was actually organised by Team England, which is the UK international Warhammer 40k team. It's full of some of the most experienced players in the country, and they regularly go all over the world playing Warhammer 40k and bringing home glory. So really, really good tournament, lads. Absolutely fantastic. They're very experienced at doing this kind of thing. This is one of their regular events, and I highly recommend it to anyone who is looking to seriously challenge themselves on the tabletop. The standard of play is very, very high. We'll get into that a little bit more in the lay of the land, but it's very, very high, the standard of play. But on the flip side, also, the tournament is incredibly well run because these guys have been all over the world. They know what it takes to put together a fantastic event. I also want to say a massive thank you to Element Games. Any of you who have watched my tournament reports before will know that I do go to a lot of events that are hosted by Element Games, and they are a really, really good venue. They are the premier venue for Warhammer 40k events in the northwest of England as far as I am concerned. They always have really, really helpful and friendly staff. They've got a fully stocked bar so you can have loads of drinks and beverages whilst you are playing your games of 40k, loads of snacks and everything, and they also have one of the largest Warhammer shops that I have ever been in. Everything you can think of is there. They've even got stuff that normally you can only get mail order straight from GW, and they've got loads of other games as well. And the painting section, my god, it's a hobbyist's wet dream. So thank you to Element Games as always. Fantastic event, fantastic venue, and all round, guys, it was just a really, really pleasant wargaming experience. And with all that said, now let's get on to everyone's favourite part of the video, the list overview. So, like I said at the beginning of the video, I was taking a combat-focused Imperial Guard army, and the theme for it very much was the Catachan Jungle Fighters. I had all the right regimental doctrines, I had the characters and the units. I really had built this army to be an ode, a tribute to the old school 3rd edition Catachan Codex. In case you guys didn't know, Catachans did used to have their own book a long, long time ago, and you can still find copies of it relatively cheaply on eBay. I do actually recommend, little side note here guys, but I do recommend that you do pick it up if you are a Guard fan or a Catachan fan. It's a really cool piece of history, and it's where you first get to see characters like Straken and Marbo make their appearance. Now we'll dive into the specific units in just a moment, but I want to give you all a quick overview of the thoughts I had when I was putting this list together. I wanted to take what looked like on the surface a normal guard army, some infantry, some tanks and some officers, but one that once you lifted the rock up and looked at the grim stuff underneath, you realised that it actually was much more punchy and combat focused. The reason I wanted to do an army like this is because I wanted one that could still play the game. I needed plenty of infantry so I could play the objectives, do my primaries, do my secondaries, all that kind of good stuff. And I also wanted a little bit of fire support in there. I didn't go nuts on the firepower. I just took a few Lehman Russes, fairly standard for any guard army, because like any good guard commander knows, the Tactica Imperialis says that you can't put too much faith in combat or too much faith in firepower. A good commander should have a balanced force. So I wanted to have some tanks that could soften the enemy up a little bit, so that when my Cadian jungle fighters and my officers went in there and to punch them, the enemy would be a little bit damaged. It would allow me to win those close combat fights. Basically, guys, I wanted what is definitely a meme list, but one that could actually play and have a chance of winning games. But now let's get into the list proper. So, of course, I was running an Arks of Omen detachment, and my compulsory selection were troop choices. My regimental doctrines were veteran guerrillas and brutal strength. Now, in case you don't know what those are, because obviously every guard army is born soldiers at the moment, veteran guerrillas allows your infantry to ignore cover, that's both light and dense, when they are within 18 inches of the enemy. It's not a hugely powerful trait. It looks better on paper than it is in reality for a lot of games, but I definitely noticed it cropping up here and there in most of the games that I played at this event. I played against a lot of marine equivalents, a lot of power armor this time round, and it was quite nice being able to have those marines go down to a 3-up save, and then if I used take aim, they actually went to a 4-up save, even though they were dug in light cover, or maybe even light cover and I was shooting across some dense. So it definitely popped up here and there. It was a nice to have. I also then took brutal strength, like I said, and that's definitely more of a fun one. It gives you +1 strength in the first round of combat, whether you charge, word charge, heroic intervention, all that kind of good stuff. And it also means that you can move and shoot with heavy weapons without penalty on your infantry. Now, the +1 strength did crop up quite a lot. Again, I faced off against a lot of toughness 4 marine equivalent infantry. It meant that a lot of the time I was going from wounding them on 5 to wounding them on 4, so that was nice. And I also consistently noticed how handy dandy it was on my heavy weapons and my infantry squads. The number of times when my guys just running around, just firing them heavy bolters from the hip, and even with take aim, they were hitting on 3s and they were rerolling 1s because Straken would be nearby and there'd be a command squad nearby and they're rerolling 1s, and then the AP -2, and then they'd be within 18 inches, so my opponents would often be like, oh, I'm only on like a 5-up save. Yeah, it was actually quite a nice combo, and I would say, weirdly, I expected the +1 strength to be the bigger thing, but I'd actually say in a lot of games, having the ability to run around with the heavy weapons, not caring about the movement penalty, and being able to stack all of those modifiers on them, and then of course, positive modifiers I should say, and then of course also combining that with veteran guerrillas, it made my heavy bolters actually pretty deadly, and it made rooting infantry out of cover overall a much easier experience. So I definitely noticed both of the traits. They weren't super powerful though, and let me be clear, I would say that Born Soldiers is superior to those 2 regiment traits. But of course, we were running a fun-themed, fluffy army, so I gotta go with the Cadian traits, right? In the HQ section, we started the Cadian theme off strong by taking Colonel Ironhand Straken. He is a really, really cool character, and he has fast become my favourite guard officer to include in my armies. I don't know if he's necessarily an auto-include, but he's definitely one that a lot of people have overlooked, and I think a lot of guard players need to start re-looking at him because he brings a whole new dynamic to your army. Yes, he is essentially a over-costed senior officer on the surface, but in reality, he brings a really concentrated package of close combat smackdown. When you give Straken his Warlord trait, Frontline Combatant, and you really should be giving him that trait, he goes from good to unbelievable in close combat. He hits on 2s with 6 attacks at strength 6. Now obviously because I had brutal strength, he was strength 7. Now his bionic arm is strength 7, AP -3, damage 2, so it's a power fist that doesn't have any negative to hit modifier, and also, because of his Warlord trait Frontline Combatant, any 6s you get to hit actually generate 2 additional hits. It's like double exploding 6s. And on top of this, he has a permanent +1 to wound modifier. And when you add that all up together, you've got a guy running around with a buttload of attacks, hitting on 2s and wounding most things he's likely to engage on 2s as well. And if you get a couple of 6s, then his damage really starts spiking through the roof. A number of times in this event, Straken would go rolling in, he'd roll 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 6s, and he would just flatten everything that he came across. He is really good because a lot of guard armies struggle with any kind of combat, and they have to try and decide, do I want to include those Rough Riders or those Kazakin, because they both cost about 100 points. But if you're already taking a senior officer, why not just spend 40 points, make them Straken, and then you've got, for a lot of guard commanders, all the close combat you're realistically going to need. So I definitely recommend Straken, not just in a fun capacity like I was running him, but also as a go-to unit for a lot of guard commanders. If you're struggling with close combat, Straken might just be the cheap answer that you're looking for. After the 1 million credit man, we had 2 command squads, and both of these were outfitted to be Dreadnorks, essentially unkillable command squads. Now, if you've not seen my video on how to build a Dreadnork, then I highly recommend you check it out. I'll either have it linked at the end of this video, or I will have a link down to it in the description below. But to give you the summary version of it, a Dreadnork is where you take a command squad and you give an Ogryn Bodyguard, and through a combination of relics and stratagems, you make it where it's almost impossible to kill these command squads. They are unbelievably tanky. They're called Dreadnork because the original one that I came up with was based on Nork Dead Dog. Now, I wasn't actually running Nork in this army. I couldn't quite afford the extra 5 points that I needed for him, but I did take 2 Ogryn Bodyguards, 1 in each command squad. Now, one command squad was a Cadian Command Squad, and I know a lot of you are going to be throwing your paintbrushes down on the ground going, that's not Catachan, that is Cadian. I know, but hear me out. I took the Cadian Command Squad because I wanted to have access to Cadia stand on one of my command squads. That's it. That's the only reason. Just take the word Cadian, cross it out, and type in Catachan in crayon above it. Okay, that's how I saw it. Now, the other command squad was a Platoon Command Squad. In the Cadian Command Squad, I had taken the Death Mask of Ollanius Pius, which meant that the whole squad had a 4% vulnerable save. I had given a Brute Shield to the Ogryn Bodyguard as well. I know some people are going to be thinking that's a bit redundant. It was, but again, I didn't have the 5 points that I needed to take the Slab Shield. I would have taken Nork Dead Dog if I had the 5 points, as simple as that. So I had to basically go for the Brute Shield. It was a little bit redundant, but at the end of the day, what I found was that my Dreadnork, my Cadian Dreadnought, basically only ever got hit by things that were AP2 anyway, so it didn't actually matter, and it did mean that the whole rest of the squad had the 4% vulnerable save, so even if the Ogryn did end up, buying the farm, the rest of the squad tended to be pretty tanky as well. The rest of the squad had normal Cadian Command Squad things. It had the flag, it had the medic, it had the Vox, and the veteran, of course, it was a combat-themed one, didn't have a special weapon, rather had a Bolt Pistol and Powersword. Officer, of course, also had a Bolt Pistol and Powersword. Now, the Platoon Command Squad was equipped in a fairly similar fashion. It had an Ogryn Bodyguard with Brute Shield and a Power Maul, and then the officer had a Bolter and Powersword. There was a medic, a Vox caster, and a Regimental standard. The differences were that in the Platoon Command Squad, you can't give a veteran a power sword. So instead, everyone had chainswords. That's actually a unique thing you can do with Platoon Command Squads. Everyone could just be given a Laspistol and chainsword if they want to, rather than having a lasgun. So that's what I did. So one command squad had a couple of extra power sword attacks, but the other command squad had a lot more extra chainsword attacks. The big difference it was, though, that the officer had the Order of the Bastium Stellaris relic. This is a relic that gives the bearer and his whole unit permanent transhuman. Now, this means that between both command squads, I had transhuman available, I had a 4+ invulnerable save available, and I had a 5+ feel no pain. And the Ogryn also reduced damage by 1, and he was the one that always took the damage first as well. These two command squads were incredibly durable, and over the course of the tournament, everything that they went into, or that went into them, basically got stopped dead in its tracks. And whilst their damage output was alright, they killed the occasional model here and there, their main function was to just completely brick wall an enemy advance, and they did it fantastically every single time. After that, we had a pretty standard tank commander. He had battle cannon with relic gatekeeper, lance cannon, and a couple of heavy bolters. And then we moved on to the troop section. In the troops, I had 5 squads of infantry with heavy bolter and melter gun, and I had 6 squads of Catachan jungle fighters. Yep, That's right, genuine Kachan jungle fighters, some of the worst troops in the whole of the Guard Codex. As it turns out, they weren't too bad. Essentially, they just died for the Emperor the same as everybody else. I mean, you're a 10-man infantry squad, you can move forward, you can screen, you can take objectives, and their main focus really was to sort of flame things, lasgun things, and then charge in and finish them off. And they did that absolutely fine. So, Kachan jungle fighters are at least somewhat usable. I know that roaring sound you can hear in the background is the dozen Kachan members of that community going, "Yes, vindication! We can use our jungle fighters again!" They were perfectly fine. They didn't let me down. I didn't feel like I was massively handicapped by taking them. They just were 10 infantry at the end of the day. And I took 6 squads of them because I was running a lot of Kachans and their close combat ability was alright. It occasionally spiked here and there, getting me a few extra hits. But overall, the Kachans did fine. The actual stars of the show, in terms of the infantry front, were the heavy bolter infantry squads. Like I said earlier, their combination of traits with veteran guerrillas and brutal strength really complemented them very well. And I ran melter guns because I didn't have a lot of sources of real ones to hit. If you notice, I basically had Straken, and his job was going to be running around punching things. So I actually went for the melter guns. One, because it's kind of Kachan. Kachans love being up close and personal. Melter guns are like that. And also because I didn't want to have a bunch of plasma guns that was going to blow up and kill themselves at the worst possible moment. And heavy bolters are great. Can't go wrong with heavy bolters. Probably the best heavy weapon you can give your infantry squads right now. After that, we get to the elites. I had taken Sergeant Harker. He was pretty consistently bad throughout the tournament. He's basically a man that runs around with a 40-point heavy bolter. The main contribution that he actually had to the event was nothing to do with his 5+ Feel No Pain or nothing to do with his heavy bolter, which I think killed 3 models over the course of the whole event. He basically served as an extra source of inflexible command. He has the officer keyword, so having him run around and be able to support my infantry and my tanks was pretty good. That was his main function. It allowed Straken to be a bit more aggressive, it allowed the command squads to be a bit more aggressive, and I still had plenty of officer coverage for flexible command. That was really his main thing. There was also a couple of times when having his extra order that could go out onto Kachan jungle fires was pretty helpful. So he was more of an officer than he was a damage dealer, which on the surface you don't really expect, but I guess if you are running Kachan jungle fighters, he does kind of come into his own at that point. Harker's Hellraisers did nothing of note throughout the entire event. They were just an infantry squad that tended to be on the front lines and die, so there we go. Then we had Sly Marbo. Sly Marbo is brilliant. In case you don't know what he does, he's basically a 50-point, very, very glass hammer assassin. He has a pistol that's 2 damage, that's just 3 shots, it can target characters, it has a chance to do some mortal wounds, and he has a combat blade, which also does 2 damage. The crazy thing about Marbo is he doesn't look like much on paper. When you take into account that everything he does is basically 2 damage, you realise, hang on a second, this guy has the potential to fairly consistently wipe out 4 or 5 Marines if he does his shooting and his charging, and he also has potential to drop in, shoot up a character if they don't get lucky on their saves or you get lucky on your hits and your wounds. He might even kill a low level character like a lieutenant, and then he can just disappear again. He can do this thing where he drops in, because he can deep strike in, he drops in, he can shoot, he can charge. When he charges, he can have a reroll to charge, and then if at the end of the turn he's still alive, whether he made his charge or not, he can just go back into reserve. Now, he can only do this go back in reserve once. He can't just keep dropping in and out every single turn. But it's pretty cool. What I tend to find is he would drop in, shoot something, fail the charge, go away again, drop in, shoot the same target, and then he'd make the charge. And between those 2 shooting drops and the charge, he tended to pick up a little 5-man squad of enemies here and there. He was perfectly okay, and he racked up a pretty decent kill tally over the course of the event. And last in the elite section, and certainly least, even worse than Harker, we had the Rattling Snipers. I took the Rattling Snipers for 2 or 3 reasons. Firstly, I wanted to try them out. Rattlings on paper just look so terrible, and they have these potential uses of being able to like move block and forward deploy and all this kind of stuff, but generally speaking they look pretty bad. But I see a lot of people just dismiss them on paper, and I was like, you know what, I want to try a squad out. I can kind of afford, taking 1 squad just to see if they really are as bad on paper, or maybe they actually turn out to be kind of cool and kind of good. As it turned out, they weren't very good at all, and they didn't really achieve very much. So I can confidently say that Rattling Snipers are terrible on paper, and they are in reality. I can tell you exactly what they achieved over the course of 5 games of the event. They killed 1 Berserker, 1 Grey Knight Strike Marine. They scored me an extra CP, and they were part of a team, so I can't say they get the sole glory for it, but they were part of a team that helped me score 4 victory points. That was their entire contribution throughout the tournament. And there is a really strong chance that I will forget to mention them again in this video, because they really didn't do very much of note at all. The other reason I took them, though, was not just because I wanted to try them out, but also because I wanted to use them to represent a traditional Cadian unit, which is the Death World Snipers. Now, because we don't have special weapon squads anymore available in Tagad, the Rattlings are basically the only sniper unit that we have. If I had special weapon squads of snipers available, I definitely would have taken them over the Rattlings, but I wanted to represent that cool, fluffy aspect of the traditional Cadian force. That covers all of the Guard infantry and officers. We then had the motor pool. I took a Hellhound. It's a Cadian list, you can't go wrong with a Hellhound, and I gave it some Weed Killer by taking it with a Chem Cannon and a Hull Heavy Flamer. Performed pretty well throughout the event. Not great, not terrible, solid 3.6, but it only died once. And I did successfully try out the Lone Wolf tactics that I've been talking about. And it did pretty good, just being stuck on a flank and burning and melting things. And then we had the core of any good Guard list, 3 Lehman Russes. We had 2 with Battle Cannon, Las Cannon, Heavy Bolters, the El Clasicos, and then we had 1 with the Exterminator and Triple Heavy Bolter, the old Dakar tank. All of these tanks performed as you would expect. They laid down some firepower. They were able to soften the enemy up. They did feel a lot less punchy than they normally did, because I didn't have Born Soldiers, but they still managed to bring just enough firepower to the table to allow the whole combat thing to go off the way I wanted it to. I know there will be some people saying, why didn't you take the Plasma Russes? Couple of reasons. 1, we all know the Plasma Russes are great, so I wanted to try something a little bit different. 2, aesthetically, I wanted the whole army to have the same colour scheme. I currently don't have any Plasma Russes in my Mordian colour scheme. And 3, I wanted to take the battle cannons because I wanted to have a bit of long range. I wanted to have something that could really outrange anything else in the game. And I did. The 72-inch range often came up and was pretty handy. I took the Exterminator because I wanted to try out a Dakar tank in a competitive setting. I've used it in a number of battle reports and it was pretty good. It performed perfectly averagely during the event. It definitely wasn't a handicap. But also, Exterminators are kind of a traditional Cadian variant for the Lehman Russ. So again, just embracing the whole theme of the army. So that covers all of the main points for the army list, but there is one other small little funny thing I want to mention about this army, which is it actually was a community one that we put together on a Mordian Glory live stream. You see, I had originally set myself a painting challenge in February to complete an entire Turned army in 1 month, and I failed miserably. I didn't get anywhere near the number of models that I needed done. And so as a result, I said, look, guys, Mordian Glory streaming community, you guys can pick the next army that I take and I will build the list live on stream and you guys can tell me what kind of units you want to see. And so this was kind of like I'd lost a bet. I had to do like a little forfeit. But overall, I think the Mordian Glory community, they were harsh but fair. They made me take the Cadian traits. They made me take those fluffy Cadian units, but they did allow me to take that solid core of any good Guard army, which is infantry and tanks. But I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone that got involved in building the list and to everyone that got involved with just the meme and the fun and the whole vibe of me taking Cadian's Combat Guard to a competitive Shark tank. And so with the army list done, now let's get into the tournament itself. So the first thing I want to touch on briefly, but it is very important, is the lay of the land. Now this is the part of the video where I talk about things like the terrain and the general player skill level. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this event was the definition of a Shark tank. The level of play here was unbelievably high. The vast majority of players, and there were about 35 active players at the event, were all seasoned tournament veterans. It was actually kind of incredible to look around the room and just see the caliber of player there. Some of the biggest names in UK tournament Warhammer 40k. So you had people like Tony Chu, who as far as I can tell has been playing at tournaments since he was born. He's really, really nice guy, by the way. You've also got Matt Robertson, who I widely consider to be the best Sisters of Battle player in Warhammer 40k, not even the UK. I consider him to be the best battle player that I've ever known. And then you've got Manny Chima, fairly well-known guy. He runs Glass Hammer and who has won LVO, LGT numerous times. Really, really strong player. Always runs the cheesiest of lists, but also always has a cheeky smile on his face as well. And then people like Josh Roberts, who's been the captain of Team England for as long as I can remember. And I don't ever remember seeing him lose a game. The guy's just an absolute machine and lovely as well. So overall, the caliber player was really good. And I would say out of the 35 players that were at the event, there was maybe 2, 3 that weren't running proper competitive lists. You had these 2 guys that were local that had turned up. One was a guard player who was running around with a Valdor Tank Hunter and a Malcador Infernus. Absolute hero. That guy deserved many a medallion crimson for during his games. Absolutely awesome. Really, really cool list, really cool models. And then you had his mate who turned up with Tal. They were the only 2 people that turned up that I didn't think knew what they were getting themselves into, and unfortunately did take a bit of a battering. And then you had me there, who I've played a few tournaments, I've done my time on the tournament circuit, but I'm there running this Mimi Katachan list. So the other 32 players and 32 lists are all ones that you would expect to win a local RTT, maybe even a small GT, and many of the top players were running things that they were expecting to go to super majors with and take the gold. So that covers the players and the skill of the event, but what about the terrain? Well, it was all WTC style terrain. This means it's L-shaped ruins and it's also forests, and the forests are all dense and the L-shaped ruins are all line of sight blocking. And I would say that it was an incredibly dense amount of terrain. This tournament had the most terrain that I've ever seen on tables. And if I was to have one small criticism, and it was the tiniest fly in the biggest of lovely ointments, I would say that the terrain was too dense. Just slightly too dense. There were numerous instances across my games where people could just hop from one terrain piece to another, often not even having to advance and just stay out of line of sight. It definitely favoured combat armies, and I just think that whilst I acknowledge that dense terrain is important, I'm not just talking dense in the trait, I'm talking the amount of terrain on the board. Whilst I acknowledge having a lot of terrain on the board is important, 9th edition is very killy, I think this one went slightly too far. And my only feedback to the TOs, and they know they did a fantastic event, they're very experienced, they don't need me to tell them, they can dismiss this as far as they're concerned. They probably know better than I do. But my one feedback would be that if the terrain could just be slightly less heavy. I mean, taking maybe one L-shaped, one forest out of there would have been enough. But yeah, it was maybe just a bit too dense. I mean, to really put it into perspective from a guard player's point of view, I was struggling to move Lehman Russes around the board, and there were numerous games when my Lehman Russes only had one way out of my deployment zone. Now, when I go to a tournament, I expect that kind of maneuverability difficulties if I'm running a Rogue or Dawn, especially if I'm running a Baneblade, where maybe you can't get that Baneblade out of your deployment zone apart from down this one pathway. But when I'm having that problem with things like Hellhounds and Lehman Russes, I really think that the movement channels were slightly too restrictive. But I don't want to overstress this point. I don't want to become the main takeaway from the video. I want to be clear that the terrain itself was perfect for competitive events. It was L-shaped ruins, it was crate, it was forest, it was all easy for players to understand, it was all very functional, and it definitely served its purpose of providing clear terrain for a competitive event. But that's enough said about terrain and lay of the land. Let's get into the exciting stuff and start off with game number 1. So game number 1 comes around and we get a pretty gnarly matchup, guys. I mean, I might be combat guard, but World Eaters are on a whole different level. This was actually the first time that I got to play against World Eaters, but their reputation had absolutely preceded them as being a very competitive faction out of the gate. Easy secondaries, fantastic killing power, and it doesn't matter if you kill them, they somehow still manage to score loads and loads of points. Now, my opponent was a really, really nice guy called Lewis, and he fully embraced the World Eater mentality. It was all gas, no brakes, and his list represented this. He had Angron, of course he had the big boy, and he also had a Khorne Lord of Skulls. I mean, when someone slaps one of those things down on the table, you know you're in for a good game. I have no idea how competitive they are, but they're a clearly epic model, so it's always awesome to see one on the tabletop. So we had these two very big beat stick units, and they were absolutely these distraction kind of effects that were going to run forward and absorb all my damage and really distract me, whilst his actual good units, his 8-bound and his berserkers, did a lot of the damage. Speaking of which, he had 3 units of berserkers and he had 3 units of exalted 8-bound as well, and he had Khan the Betrayer and 2 rhinos. His force was pretty compact and elite, but each individual unit did have a lot of killing power. Under normal circumstances, I would have been fairly confident in this matchup because Born Soldiers plus all my screening would allow me to just blow him back to the Stone Age. But I don't have Born Soldiers, and my firepower itself is actually quite limited. I'm not running plasma russes, for example, and also a lot of my infantry are just running around with flamers. I mean, they're not really great into Astartes and toughness 5, 8-bound. But at the end of the day, I was a Cadian commander now, and I was not going to let it phase me. I decided that the Emperor does not always give us what we want. He gives us what we need. And in this case, I needed to send these Red Devils back to the warp from whence they came with my bayonets and my big brazen balls. Now, the mission was the Scouring. This is where there are 5 primary objectives, and both players have a short table edge to deploy on. If you're an old longbeard like me, it's hammer and anvil style deployment. Now, in terms of secondaries, my opponent took all 3 of the World Eater ones, because why wouldn't you? In many circumstances, they're all an auto 15. And then I took Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and I went for Raise the Banners as well. For deployment, my opponent put nothing in reserve. Instead, he had Angron hiding behind the big L-shaped ruin at the back of his deployment zone. And then he had his Berserkers in Rhinos, 1 on the left flank, 1 on the right flank. And likewise, he did a similar sort of thing with his 8-bound, 1 on the left flank, 1 on the right flank. And I think he had an extra squad on his right flank as well. Khan the Betrayer was in the Rhino, which only had 5 Berserkers in it. And that was pretty much his deployment. Oh, of course, the Khorne Lord of Skulls was on the right flank as well. Now, my deployment was a fairly standard Imperial Guard affair. I deployed infantry at the front, and I had 2 lines of those, and then I had my tanks at the back. The only slight variance over my normal deployment is my officers were in the middle line rather than the 3rd line. Normally, I keep my officers as far back as possible because, of course, I don't want them to be anywhere near the front line, giving up assassinate points potentially, or just having the chain of command fall apart and not having any orders. But as I was running Straken and I was running command squads, I figured I could kind of be ballsy with them. I didn't want to be overly aggressive and stick them right at the front because I didn't know exactly what World Eaters did, and I wasn't sure how much damage my command squads would be able to absorb from them. So I screened with a layer of infantry. I had about 40 Catan jungle fighters up front. Then behind them, I had the rest of my infantry and my command squads, essentially. The only other thing of note is to say that the Hellhound was on my right flank, so the opposite flank to the Lord of Skulls. Obviously wasn't going to have a Hellhound stare down that big boy. And I also had Marbo go straight into reserve. So after everyone had deployed, it was time to see who was going to go first, and my opponent won the roll-off. And his first turn took about 5 minutes. Everything just went forward. Just gunned it forward as fast as he could. So Angron went from behind the big line of sight blocking, definitely can't see him, completely opaque ruin that was at the back of his deployment zone, and flew forward to the other L-shaped ruin that was at the front of his deployment zone. But that one had a load of windows in it, and Angron is a big boy, so you can see him if you can see him, even if he's behind big bits of obscuring terrain. It's a bit like a Bane Blade or an Imperial Knight. My opponent's infantry went as far forward as they could, and most of them stuck to the cover as best as they could as well. And he had no shooting worth speaking of. A couple of storm bolters rang out from the rhinos, and that was basically it. Turn 1, very aggressive ballsy maneuver forward. He did scan one of the objectives as part of the primary, and that was World Eater turn number 1. Coming over to my turn 1, also incredibly quick, very, very fast-paced game. One positive thing I can say about the World Eater is you always finish with plenty of time left over one way or another. So I realised that I need to screen him out because I don't want that Lord of Skulls to start coming down and messing my tanks up. So I move a bunch of infantry forward to move block the Lord of Skulls and to also essentially move block his berserkers. And about 40 Cadian jungle fighters make the heroic sacrifice to just move forward and form part of Operation Human Shield. In terms of my damage output, this is where I really start to notice not having born soldiers. I pile everything into Ogryn, and I just managed to kill him. It was a very, very close run affair. Even with it basically came down to my opponent rolling a CP reroll and failing it. Otherwise, Ogryn would have lived, and that would have been a big old problem for me. As it was, Ogryn did get sent back to the warp. I can confidently say that if I had born soldiers with the dice I was rolling, the fact that he's only toughness 7, and the fact I've got a lot of damage 3 weapons, he probably would have been sent back to hell with just 2 tanks and a bit of infantry fire. As it was, it took all 4 battle tanks to deal with him. That was essentially my damage output. I tickled the Lord of War with a few lasguns here and there. I think I chipped a wound off or 2, but I didn't kill it at all. My opponent's turn 2 comes around and it's crunch time. So I get charged by a unit of 8 bound into a screening squad of infantry, and I get charged by Khan. Khan doesn't actually make a charge. We'll come back to him in a second. A unit of berserkers goes into a squad of infantry, and a unit of 8 bound also goes into a squad of infantry, another unit on the other flank. That is his charges, and naturally he just picks up all 30 infantry. The Khorne Lord of Skulls, by the way, had been blasting away at my tanks as it moved up the board, but it's not really got the damage output that it needs to achieve. And I was just like dense terrain or smoke screen to basically cripple most of its incoming shots. Of course, it did charge the 10 infantry that were movement blocking it, and then Khan went for a charge on Straken. He was going over some dense terrain, so it turned out to be a 10 or 11 inch charge. My opponent said he was going to go for it because it's the Khan thing to do, to go after the big bad in the army. And I'd talked Straken up and been like, he is pretty nasty. I said, Straken's going to get you. Straken's going to get you. If you don't get him, Straken's going to get you. And my opponent was like, well, as a World Eater, I better go after Straken then. I need to claim his skull for Khorne. You see what I mean? Like, the guy was running a decent list and he had the right attitude and all that kind of stuff. So it was a great first game to play against. Unfortunately, Khan didn't make the charge. It comes back over to my turn 2, and I'm like, right, I need to do the classic guard thing of picking these things up, and then I can start moving into the middle of the board. I've weathered the first Berserker charge. I can probably weather another one, but after that, I really need to start motoring and getting on with clearing the board. So Straken naturally goes into Khan. He moves, he chips a wound off him with the plasma pistol, and then he charges in. The command squad goes into the 8 bound, which had cleared up a unit of infantry. And likewise, on the other flank, the other command squad went up to a unit of 8 bound, ready to deal with them. The berserkers were cleared off from the various lasgun fire, the 5 berserkers that had gone in. And the 8 bound, both units are weakened a little bit, a few wounds done here and there to the 8 bound to try and just soften them up a little bit before all of my combat stuff goes rolling in. Then it comes to the tank shooting, and I'm like, right, we've killed Ogryn, we've killed one big beastie, but have we killed second big beastie? Not yet. So I put all of my tanks into the Lord of Skulls, and I don't quite finish it off. I actually lived at about 6 wounds. It's badly degraded, but there you go. Fortunately, I had movement blocked it again, so it was just sat there, just trundling through guardsmen 1 or 2 inches a turn. Now, just to skip ahead a little bit to turn 3, it actually takes a surprising amount of firepower to kill that Lord of Skulls off. It's toughness 8 at the end of the day, so outside of Gatekeeper, I am struggling to get those wounds through. I do end up managing to kill it, but it does take the majority of my tank firepower at turn 3. My dice are just a little bit cold on the wounding. But going back to turn 2. charges. So the command squad on the left, which is tying up 1 unit of 8 bound, goes in and I think does a couple of wounds to one from the Ogryn Bodyguard, and then nothing else happens. The 8 bound strike back at them and don't do anything. Basically just bounce off. I think I took a couple of wounds on the Ogryn, but that was it. This is when I started to realise, hang on, these command squads are pretty tough. Because remember, I'm just transhuman. And my opponent didn't have a huge amount of blood tithe points. He hadn't had enough blood tithe to be able to get all his buffs off yet. And bear in mind, it's at the end of his turn 2, he had only got, I think, 4, maybe 6 blood tithe points in total. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to bring Angron back straight away. So he decided to wait. At the end of my turn 2, I didn't kill either one of those 8 bound squads. And I didn't kill the Khorne Lord of Skulls either. So he actually gets very little blood tithe points from me either. So weirdly, my army just wasn't feeding him the blood tithe points that he needed to start making these 8 bound go nuts with exploding 6s and all this other stuff that they can do. So the 8 bound end up taking, let's say on average, both ogres down to about half wounds. The 8 bound, that was the command squad on the left, was the one that kind of both squads just bounced each other. On the right, my other command squad, the one you can see here now, that actually was really successful. It was only facing down 1.5 8 bound essentially, and the Ogryn just went absolutely bonkers and killed all of the 8 bound apart from one had 1 wound left, and then the officer pulled out his dueling power sword and was like, "How about you, sir?" and like stabbed his saber through its eye and he killed it. So they actually did okay on the right flank. They were able to clear off the unit of 8 bound. Then we got to Straken. Straken versus Khan. 1v1. Fight me. And Straken brought the pain, boys. Oh my god, it was such an amazing initial display of power. Straken goes rolling in, rolling up. He goes rolling up, and he just goes, right, 6 attacks. Oh yeah, look, there's 4 6s. The guy went from having 6, he didn't get any ones, but from 6 attacks to having 14 hits. And then he like dropped 1 or 2 wounds. So he rolled about 12 wounds on Khan. Khan proceeded to fail a legitimate amount of invulnerable saves. He didn't roll particularly well, particularly badly. He just rolled normally. And Khan got absolutely smashed to pieces by Straken. And it was the beginning of a trend. Straken just going in there and beating the ever-living daylights out of all of the characters and stuff that he went up against. It was beautiful. So Straken 1v1'd the chosen mortal champion of Khorne, and he flattened him before he even had a chance to react. Like, I can just imagine Straken just going in there and like Khan has been like, "Who's willing to fight me? Mere mortals, who's willing to fight me?" And then before he knows it, like this blur just comes out of nowhere. And then Khan sees blackness for a moment, and then he wakes up and he's back in the warp, trying to explain to Daddy Khorne how a man with a bionic arm just punted him so hard that he went back to hell. It was honestly one of the just most epic moments of the first game. Just Straken absolutely tearing Khan a new one. That was the end of my turn 2, and at this point I was feeling pretty confident about the game. My opponent had killed some infantry, but he'd lost a unit of 8 bound. His other unit of 8 bound were completely tied up, and then he had one last unit of 8 bound who up until this point had kind of had to sit back on an objective. They'd done like a scan, and then my opponent was going to like swap them over with like a rhino, but essentially I dealt with 2/3 of the 8 bound. I'd either killed or contained 2/3 of the 8 bound, which I was pretty happy with. But going into turn number 3, my opponent's in a really tricky position because he doesn't have the blood tithe points that he was expecting. He thought he'd be in double digits of blood tithe by now, but he's actually not earned that much. He's killed about 4 or 5 squads of infantry, and he's lost Khan and a squad, and that's it. So he doesn't quite have enough. However it works out, he doesn't quite have enough to bring Angron back and also score the points that he wants to score and also get some buffs off that he wants to do as well. So he decides that points mean prizes, so he focuses on spending his blood tithe points so that he can start maxing out one of his secondaries. Remember, he's only got turn 3, turn 4, turn 5 to do that, so he needs to start doing it now. In my opponent's turn, the Lord of Skulls continues to kill a couple of squads of infantry that were move blocking it, and the 8-bound continue to wail on the command squad, but it's just not doing that much. His other unit of 8-bound start getting into the fight, but they're not quite able to get the charge off, unfortunately for him. And then a couple of units of Berserkers come rolling in, and one of them goes into a command squad, which they just bounce off, and the command squad in return just flattens them. Ogryn Bodyguard just goes, and just fucking bonks them on the head and basically kills them. And then between the two power swords, they get finished off. So that was kind of interesting. And then he had one unit of Berserkers that went into an infantry squad and just killed it. But that's it. That's all my opponent does. He's just killing infantry at this point. So I've lost probably 6 or 7 infantry squads at this point. But I've still got plenty. As you can see there, that's what I had at the end of the game. So I still had plenty left. So I'm feeling pretty confident at this point. And I kind of go into that classic sort of guard mop-up mode. So what I do is in the shooting phase, I clear out his Berserkers. And I also, I clear out his Berserkers, I kill both Rhinos, and I finish off the Lord of Skulls. In combat, Straken goes into the 3/8-bound that are just failing to get past the Ogryn Bodyguard. And I think at this point, maybe the Ogryn Bodyguard had died, but it had taken 2 or 3 rounds of combat for them to do it. I'd just been using transhuman, and I'd been using CP rerolls, and I'd got quite lucky with my Feel No Pains. A theme which would continue throughout the event, but that's just a little bit of foreshadowing. But Straken goes into the 8-bound. Now, one of them has taken a couple of wounds, but he just goes in, and he just powers up the arm again, guys. He goes absolutely nuts. And he just goes in, he gets a couple of 6s, and he doesn't miss with anything. He doesn't fail to wound anything, and he just flattens the 8-bound. Completely flattens them in a heartbeat. There's nothing my opponent could do. Even with the CP reroll, it just doesn't matter. Straken's going in there with 10 hits, 10 wounds, and he only needs to get 5 past to finish the squad off, and he just manages to do it. Even with the CP reroll, he just manages to do it. So Straken was an absolute weapon again, and his tally by the end of the game was Khan and those 3 8-bound. Now, skipping ahead a little, that's the end of turn 3. My opponent now literally has 3 8-bound on the table. That's basically my opponent's whole thing. So he brings Angron back his turn 4. It's like, I'm not going to win the game, I might as well do something epic. He brings Angron back turn 4. Now, he decides he wants to go after Marbo. Marbo had just been harassing him and just been like dropping into the backfield, and I was like, I just don't want you to bring Angron back anywhere useful. So I literally just dropped Marbo in. He'd like Uzi'd a Rhino in the back or something. He hadn't really done that much, and then he just been chilling out, waiting for just denying Angron's deep strike ability. But Angron decides, you know what, I'm going to go after Marbo turn 4, and he drops him, and he rolls his charge, and he fails, and he rolls his charge with the CP reroll, and he just fails it. And Angron fails to get into Marbo, and he just sat there on 8 wounds, looking pretty exposed. And like I said, the 8-bound, also the last 8-bound squad my opponent had, they went in and they finished Straken off, and that was kind of it. Comes around to my turn 4, and I fall back with the command squad against the 8-bound who just killed Straken, and I just blow the 8-bound away. They get the brunt of the firepower for the tanks and from 2 of the tanks and the infantry, and then I fire Gatekeeper in against Angron, and I managed to get a couple of wounds past Angron, which meant that he only had 2 wounds left, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna fire Marbo at him next. I'm going to fire, because Marbo's pistol's damage too, right? So I'm going to fire Marbo at him next. And Marbo gets 3 hits. He gets 2 wounds, wounding on 5s, one of which is a 6, so he does a mortal wound. And then my opponent just proceeds to fail both armor saves. And so Sly Marbo, the one-man army, takes down Angron, the Demon Primarch. I like to imagine that Angron sees him, it's like, Marbo, Khorne wants your soul, and he strides forward to get him, and he just trips over this really fine, like, bit of tripwire, and all these, like, traps are, like, going off, like, slowing him down, like, and Angron's like, oh, God, what, damn it, and he, like, steps on, like, this giant, like, punji stake piece, like, oh, God, ow, 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 and then before he knows it, Marbo's just appeared in front of him, like, hanging on to, like, one of his horns, he just jams his Mac 10, his silence Uzi, into Angron's eyes, like, eat this, and just fucking blows his brains out of the back of his skull. It was so cool, it was so epic. Marbo killing Angron, honestly, one of the most epic moments I've ever had in Warhammer 40k. And that was the end of game number 1, and what a start to the tournament. So many epic, cool moments, and there was still 4 more games to go. Now, in terms of the final score, I'll briefly mention this. The Guard obviously won. We got a solid 92 points. Good start to the event. But the World Eaters, despite the fact they had essentially been tabled on turn number 3 and then properly tabled turn number 4, still managed to walk away with 69 points. A rather Slaneshi number, if I do say so myself. Now, that's kind of ominous. That's kind of foreshadowing. The fact that they were able to score so many victory points in essentially just 3 turns. The fact that my opponent nearly maxed out all his secondaries in such a short amount of time really gave me an idea of how difficult it could be to face off against the Worldies. My opponent had basically been smashed on primary, but had still walked away with a very, very respectable amount of points. And I have played games where getting, 69, 70, 71 points has been enough to secure me a victory. So they went away with a low-scoring, potentially game-winning score, and they've been tabled by turn 3. But we'll come back to World Eaters later on, because now it's time to go into game number 2 against the supposed superior creations of the Emperor, the Custodes. So game 2 rolls around and I get paired up against Josh Roberts, who is the captain of Team England. So I already know it's going to be a really, really hard game. And then I see the list he's got and I'm just like, oh God! Because he is running the quintessential Custodes bulldozer list. It is 23 Custodian Wardens, backed up by a bunch of other supporting units. A couple of baby knights, Trajan's in there, he's got a banner in there. All of the just gnarliest Custodes stuff that you could possibly face off against. And those 23 Wardens, their whole job is just to walk across the board and just smash everything. They've got that inbuilt feel no pain, they've got a -1 to hit, they can transhuman, they can turn off rerolls. It's just, I need one of the squads can advance and charge. It's not great. But I do have lots of screening infantry. We are playing on a hammer and anvil game again. So it's 6 objectives. So I do have time to shoot him. I've got 3 objectives that I can hold relatively easily as well. And I think, you know what, there might be a chance here. And I take Josh through my list and he's most amused to learn about how I'm taking this because I failed a hobby challenge and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of funny how you have to take through the captain of a team who's extremely knowledgeable of 40k, and you have to explain to him what the hell Veteran Guerrillas does and what the hell Brutal Strength does. So that was kind of funny. Now, the mission was recover the relics, to be clear, and in terms of secondaries, I went for banners, boots, and inflexible command again. I figured that I've got 3 objectives relatively near to my deployment zone, I've got a lot of infantry, I should be able to hold on to at least 2 banners, probably 3 over the majority of the game. Boots, of course, relatively easy one for me to do. Now, if I can get a couple of command squads in the centre of the board, I might be able to score an extra boots point here and there. And inflexible command's an easy 15. Now, my opponent goes for Stand the Vigil, and he goes for banners. Now, I can't remember exactly what his 3rd secondary was. It may have been engage on all fronts, but if that conflicts with Vigil, then he didn't go for that one. In terms of deployment, my opponent deployed everything behind L-shaped ruins because there was a lot of dense terrain. As you can look at that terrain, guys. There's no way you'd ever see anything in your opponent's deployment zone. It's just bonkers. So my opponent deployed everything behind L-shaped ruins, and I deployed my standard 3-line guard formation, infantry, officers, infantry, and then tanks at the back. Now, Josh gets the first turn, and he moves everything from the L-shaped ruins that are in his deployment zone behind the L-shaped ruins that are outside of his deployment zone in the middle of the board. That's his whole first turn. He doesn't expose anything. I have literally 0 line of sight. He gives me one thing to shoot at, which is these 5 Sisters of Silence of Flamethrowers had done a little flanking maneuver and they burned my Rattlings off the objective that they had forward deployed onto. It meant that I got 1 CP at the beginning of his turn, but then I didn't get the extra CP at the beginning of my turn because the mission said that you could only score CP if you held an objective in no man's land. And Josh was like, well, I might as well just deny you a CP. It's an equal trade. It's like 50 points roughly. And I was like, okay, fair enough. So my turn 1 comes around. I move on to my objectives. I hide out of line of sight as best as I can. I try and bait him out with a unit here, and I try and bait him out with a tank there, but he doesn't take the bait. So all I kill in my turn, 1 is those 5 sisters. And then turn 2 comes around, and Josh proceeds to continue to consolidate behind these huge terrain pieces. And he does yeet out a 3-man unit of wardens at me. And, they do actually manage to... I'd been a bit cautious. I'd only towed a few guys onto the objective. I'd forgotten that his Custodes were double obsec. So he just moves 3 wardens onto my objective. And he chops up 1 infantry squad. And it's like, oh, I actually only have a couple of guys on the objective myself. So it turns out he actually, with his 1 man that I'd managed to consolidate onto the objective, cancels out my ability to hold it. So that was a mistake on my part. I should have been a little bit more like just shove like 10... I should have just like 20. I should have shoved 20 bodies onto the objective, but I was slightly overcautious. But that's his turn 2. That's it. That's all that's happened. My turn 2, naturally, I advance forward. I consolidate, try and hold my objectives. I'm trying to push on as much as I can. But I don't want to go. I don't want to give him the ability to charge out with like 20 wardens. And so what happens is my turn 2, I kill those 3 wardens essentially. And I then also move a bunch of units forward. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to bring him out into the open. I'm going to move 2 units of infantry forward, flat out into the middle of the board, right in that big kill zone. And if he takes the bait, great. And if he doesn't, then I've got 20 infantry that are going to start getting me extra boots points. Whatever. I'm kind of just trying to make something happen because the game is being unbelievably cagey at this point. And the reason it's being so cagey is because Josh fears Imperial Guard firepower. But something happens in turn number 2, which makes him realize he doesn't need to fear it. Which is, I don't have Born Soldiers, so I fire like everything I've got into this unit of like 3 Custodian Wardens, and I only just managed to kill them with my tanks. And you can see that the light bulb go off, and he's like, oh, actually this guard army doesn't have a huge amount of firepower. So his turn 3 just rolls around, and he just goes forward. He just marches everyone out into the middle. He picks up those 20 infantry, and he just is sat there out in the middle of the open, basically, against what would normally be a guard gun line. And it comes over to my turn 3, and I put everything I have into him. I fire everything I've got, and I kill 5 Custodian Wardens. And I can tell you now, and Josh said this to me afterwards, he said, if you had had Born Soldiers, there's no way I ever would have done that maneuver. And if I had done it, there's no way I would have survived. He said I would have expected to lose the majority of my Wardens. But you didn't have the big bullshit banner, you didn't have Cajun Shock, and you didn't have like Plasma Rusters and stuff like that. So, and you didn't have Born Soldiers. He said if you had Born Soldiers, that simply would have made the difference. And I agree with him 100%. The number of times I was rolling like 5s and 6s to hit, and it was just like, well, can't do anything. So, unfortunately, that kind of... by only killing 5 out of 20 Wardens, that kind of spells doom for me. Because Josh just crashes into these objectives. 5 Wardens from the remaining squad go onto one objective. 10 Wardens go on to the other objective. And they just crash into me. And the problem I've got then is that I lose a lot of infantry. And he's double obsec. And I don't have the firepower. Like, even if I do exactly the same thing... for like 3, for my remaining 3 turns, I might just kill all the Wardens, but he's in my lines at this point, so there's nothing I can do. And so that kind of spells, that's kind of the game, guys, to be honest. And so what ends up happening, there was 2 epic moments. So 2 epic moments that I want to let you guys be aware of. Firstly, those 10 Wardens that were untouched ended up charging into my Cadian Command Squad with the Death Mask, and they didn't kill it. 8 Wardens got to strike, and they killed the Ogryn Bodyguard, and that was it. So he couldn't believe how durable it was. He was like, wow, that is something else. That is really, really insane. And he got after the game, and I was kind of proud of this moment. After the game, he asked me to take him through how I built 2 of these command squads, and I also like explained it to like a couple of the other people on Team England as well, like how I did it, and they were all like, "Wow, okay, it's not something that they were necessarily they're going to do, but they are of course looking to run guard at the moment, and they want to be able to be aware of all the tricks and stuff in the background." So they've definitely filed that knowledge away. And so if you see a Team England guy go to a tournament, he's running double Dreadnork, I'm going to claim the moral high ground on that one, boys. Amazing. But that was, and that, like I said, that was basically game number 3. The Custodians essentially just marched through my army. I did end up holding my home objective with essentially like a command squad, about 30 infantry and my tanks, but I lost everything else, and the Custodes by the end of the game were, you know, whittled down to about 10 or so wardens and other little bits running around, but they just marched forward, chop, shoot, chop, shoot, chop, shoot, and there wasn't much I could really do about it. The other epic moment though, so we had the one moment where the command squad just tanked 10 Custodes wardens, which was just so satisfying. The other cool moment was when Straken went in against Trajan. I managed to get Straken, and I almost... One little side note here. I think I would have been able to do a lot more damage in my turn 2 if Straken had made his charge, but bloody Tanglefoot Grenade. It should be called Trollfoot Grenade. It's so annoying. So Straken only had like a 5-inch charge on these Custodes, and then Josh used Tanglefoot Grenade. He got the classic like 5 or 6 to just double my charge distance. And then naturally, I just didn't make, a 5-inch charge going to like a 10-inch charge. Even the CP reroll, it wasn't likely. So Straken, didn't get in. But cool thing is that my opponent stoically refused to engage Straken because he's like, I just don't want Straken coming anywhere near me. I know he'll pick up like 3 or 4 Custodian Wardens given half a chance. And I was like, yeah, buddy. But he did. Straken eventually managed to get into Trajan. I managed to get to a point where Trajan couldn't see me, and I charged Straken in, and it was this weird trend that was set. Straken went in, and he actually, he didn't get any 6s, but he did get like 6 hits. He got like 6 wounds, and then Trajan, failed a few invulnerable saves, made a few feel no pains, and ended up taking about 4 wounds, which I was pretty happy. Straken taking 4 wounds off Trajan. He's a pretty tough beast. And then Trajan struck back against Straken, and I was like, oh dear, I'm in big trouble now. Trajan got 6 hits, 6 wounds, and then Straken just proceeded to pass 5 out of 6 4 invulnerable saves. And there's this weird thing that Straken kept doing where it was like he had a switch on his bionic arm, and he had to switch it to either attack or protect. And it was like, when he switched it to attack, he'd go in and he'd get like 4 hits, 4 6s, and just mullet anything that he came across. But then there'd be times when he'd go in and he'd just bounce, like he did against Trajan. But then any incoming attacks, he just somehow seemed to tank him. It's like he only had a set amount of luck, and I could, sometimes that luck would fall on the damage output, and sometimes it would fall on the damage input. But it was kind of cool that Straken went toe to toe against Trajan Valoris, the leader of the Custodes, of the Emperor's personal bodyguard. And not only that, but Straken did more damage to Trajan than Trajan did to him, which is pretty badass if you ask me. But at the end of game number 2, I had lost fairly resoundingly. Well played to Josh. He did exactly what he should have done. He played it cagey, he used the terrain to his advantage, and when he was able to apply the pressure, make the big push, and secure the victory, he did it at the exact right moment. So that was game number 2. But without further ado, let's crack on with game number 3. And this time, the Sons of Khorne are back for another go. So game number 3 rolls around, and it is the last game of the first day. Of course, this being a GT, there are 5 games in total, but the next 2 games are going to take place the next day on Sunday. Now, in this battle, I get paired up against Ed, and straight away from the beginning, I know it's not going to be the same as the last game, because Ed has brought multiple small units, and it's very obvious to me that he has really built his army around his army mechanics and his secondary objectives. You see, the problem my opponent had in game 1 is he didn't really have enough units. And that meant he didn't really have a steady stream of blood tithe points. But Ed had gone completely the opposite way. He didn't have Khan, he didn't have Angron, he didn't have a Lord of Skulls. Instead, he just had Lord Invocatus, and then he had lots of small units of infantry. And the core design of his army was to run out, kill something, and then die. And he wanted to die. You see, how his army worked is he had these 2 units of jackals, these were cultists, and he purposely frontlined those so they were touching an objective, but also easy for me to see. That meant that if I killed them, not only would he get a blood tithe point, but he'd also fulfill one of his secondaries. By the way, he took all 3 World Eater secondaries, of course he did. He then had 6 units of berserkers, each one with 5 berserkers in. These units were really good at running in, killing one squad. They've got the damage output to just flatten something. But then they're not that durable, so then they die. Again, he makes sure they die on objectives. That means that not only is he getting a blood tithe point in my turn, because he's killed a squad, he's getting a blood tithe point in his turn, because the units died, and then he also is getting 2 victory points as well, because he's killed one of my units on an objective, and then his unit has died on an objective as well. So his whole army is just built around trading. Go in, kill something, earn points, die. And all his units are relatively cheap and affordable to be able to do this. But then he had a really solid core, because you can't just trade and die. You do also need to be able to do damage to your opponent when your opponent brings something big out to play, right? And this is where his 8-bound came in, and he had a shed load of them. He had 3 squads of 4 normal 8-bound and 2 squads of 3 exalted 8-bound. That is literally double the 8-bound that I faced in my first game. So his list was pretty strong is what I'm trying to say, but I was quietly confident, because at the end of the day, it's a combat army going in against Guard. And yeah, I don't have Born Soldiers, but I still have lots of firepower, and he can't fly. I mean, his Lord Invocatus can, but apart from that, he can't fly. Which means that if I screen, yeah, he's going to kill a bunch of infantry, but he's not going to get into any of the important units like my Leman Russes. And my plan is he will batter himself against my infantry lines and my command squads, whilst my firepower ends up pulling the game back for me and winning it. I think this is going to be one of those games where I'll probably be behind on points for the first couple of turns, but then turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, I'll start pulling it back. That's my game plan. Now, the mission was Data Scry Salvage, and for my secondaries, I went for Boots on the Ground and Inflexible Command, classic, and I also went for Retrieve Data. I didn't go for banners because I've taken banners on this mission before and achieved very few points in it. The objectives are too far in the middle. They're just too far away from your deployment zone, and you tend to find that you get cleared off them pretty easily. My opponent went for all 3 of the World Eater ones, like I said. In terms of deployment, my opponent basically had all his 8-bound in the middle behind some L-shaped ruins. He moved from one L-shaped ruin to the next, as you would expect. And then he had 2 units of Berserkers in a Rhino at the bottom left of his deployment zone, 2 units of Berserkers in a Rhino in the top of his deployment zone, and then he had a unit of Jackals in reserve, and he had a couple of units of Berserkers in reserve as well. Now, my deployment was the standard 3 lines of death that I have been doing in every game so far. But if I could just have a little gripe for a moment, this really was the first game where I noticed the terrain, which is far too dense. If you see the picture now, my Leman Russes have got one way out of that deployment zone, going up to the right there. That's it. Going to the left, this picture doesn't quite do it justice, but going to the left, the Hellhound can squeeze past that ruin because it hasn't got sponsons. But the Leman Russes, because of their sponsors, because no point of the model can hang over the edge of the board and everything, it means that I can't actually fit through that gap. So my Leman Russes have precisely one way out of my deployment zone. And look at that deployment zone as well. If I had brought a Baneblade, I couldn't physically deploy it. If I brought a Rogal Dawn, I probably couldn't have deployed it very easily at all. It really was silly having only one way out of my deployment zone for a vehicle the size of a Russ. That's a medium tank. There are loads of vehicles. The majority of vehicles in 40k, I would say, are the same size as a Leman Russ. And so this was what I was talking about at the beginning of the video with the lay of the land. This really was a case of there being too much terrain. In other games, obviously, there'd been a lot of terrain where people could jump from cover to cover. That was just a prevailing theme throughout the event. But at least I'd always be able to maneuver around where I needed to go. This terrain map and this board I found to be too restrictive. But once we had deployed and I'd stopped being a salty bitch about the terrain and the deployment, we then got on to see who was going to get first turn. And my opponent got first again. So that means 3 games in a row I've gone second. Sometimes that's been good, sometimes that's been bad. Now, my opponent basically does a similar thing to what had happened in game 2. He moves everything from the L-shaped ruins that are in his deployment zone behind the L-shaped ruins that are on the middle of the board. And then, interestingly, that's kind of where he's comfy being. He brings 1 unit of his 8-bound out and he just throws them against 2 units of my guard and just kills them. That's the picture you can see right now. And he just did that because he wanted to get more blood tithe points. He wanted to get the blood tithe just going as quickly as possible. So his unit of 8-bound in his first turn run out, killed 2 units of guardsmen, and his jackals in the top of the board move on to a couple of objectives. And that was it. Okay. Now in my turn, I'm like, all right, I'm going to kill those 8-bound, which I do. I just shoot them to death relatively easily. And I move my infantry forward as far as I can, trying to, take ground, take the fight to the enemy. I've got to make things happen. I can't just let him box me into my deployment zone. And then I kill the jackals as well. Now, by killing the jackals, he actually got 2 victory points because they were strung out across 2 objectives. They got 2 victory points. And he did check with the TO to make sure that that was right. And the TO ruled that, yep, if you're across 2 objectives and you die on it, you get a couple of points for your secondaries. And then I killed the 8-bound. And then I secured the objectives as best as I could. A couple of units of infantry on each one, having a good time. Then it goes back to my opponent's turn 2. And I expect him, because he's in a position to do this, to just boil out of the objectives and just smash into my line. I've given him the opportunity to do it. I've tried to be clever and bait him out. I put some units out in the open, but he is stoically refusing to move anywhere where they are not objectives. He will not go anywhere near it. And so what ends up happening is he plays it quite cagey and he keeps a unit of 8-bound on the objective behind a big L-shaped piece of terrain. And then he has all the rest of his 8-bound in this big sort of death ball in the L-shaped terrain just above it. And this allows him to, if I take him off his objective, he can just send a squad of 8-bound onto it. And you can see it now. It's those 2 ruins that are in the middle. You've got the crates, the small ruin where you can see the 8-bound, and then he's got another unit of 8-bound behind the big ruin there. And his whole plan is just if he boils out of me, he'll just die, right? But if he just essentially just plays the counterattack game on that objective, he's going to consistently score loads of blood tithe. He's going to consistently also get loads of objective points. So he's playing it right, but he's playing it cagey. And I'm like, come on, Ed, come on, you're world here. Come at me. Come and kill me. Score the throne. And he's like, nah, man, I'm playing it smart. I'm playing it cagey. I'm like, okay, mate, fair enough. That's actually probably the smart play. So that's what happens in the south. He doesn't come at me. In the north, where his jackals had died, he brings another unit of jackals on from reserve and a unit of berserkers from the rhino. And the jackals string out across 2 objectives again, and the and kill one of the infantry squads, and the berserkers kill another infantry squad that I put on the objective. Really, unfortunately, I didn't quite have the movement to be able to get more than 1 squad onto the objective at a time. So I'm feeding my units into him, and it's exactly the scenario that he wanted. It wasn't ideal. But I do have a command squad in the north, and I know that once it moves on to an objective, whilst it's not OBSEC, will not just move on to objective, die, and give him loads of secondary points. So that's my opponent's turn 2. He keeps yeeting these low-level units into me at the top, and he's playing a bit cagey in the south. And I decide, you know what, if the World Eaters aren't going to come to me, I'm going to go to the World Eaters. Because my opponent clearly doesn't think that I can clear him off that bottom objective. And you know who's on that bottom objective? You know who's nearby? Goddamn Straken, the Iron Man himself. And so Straken and a command squad decide to teach these Cornate worshippers the meaning of melee combat. And in my turn 2, I clear him off the north objectives again. I secure them as best as I can, although, again, unfortunately, I know it's only an infantry squad in each one, so I know I'm probably not going to be able to stop him from doing his trick of move on, kill something, and then die. But I've got them again myself there, at least. Stops him from getting loads of primary points. Side note, when facing World Eaters, it's a really annoying catch-22 scenario, because either you clear them off the objectives and then secure the objective yourself, And that way you stop your opponent getting primary points, because obviously if you don't move on to those objectives, your opponent will be like, oh, I've got more primary than you. I guess I'll just score 12 primary. Or you move on to the objectives and you deny them primary, but then you just feed them loads of secondaries. It's really unfortunate. One way or another, the World Eaters are just going to score really highly. But that's what happens in the north. And that's just a constant back and forth trade battle between infantry squads with some support from the tanks and jackals and berserkers just flying in. The south is where the 8-bound are. That's where the big brawls are going to go down. And I decide that if the World Eaters aren't going to come to me, I'm going to go to the World Eaters. And I am going to take him off the objective. And I'm going to show him what Iron Hand Straken can do. And so Straken and the command squad go in against this unit of 8-bound. And it's amazing, boys. Straken rolls in. And he gets 1-1. So he does miss an attack. And then he proceeds to get 5 6s, generating an additional 10 attacks. Meaning that from 6 attacks, Straken ends up with 15 hits. Oh, baby! Oh, baby! He then rolls to wound, and I think maybe drops like 1, but not many. He doesn't drop many at all. And he proceeds to flatten 3 and a bit 8-bound. He like almost kills the squad outright. And then the Ogryn Command Squad just goes in and just bonks the last one on the head and just kills it. But Straken basically did the lion's share of killing 4 8-bound in one go. One absolute weapon. One absolute monster. I mean, he just introduced the corn to the meaning of pain again. I like to think he says that, like, how many times I've teach you this lesson, old man? He's just going in there, just cutting them to pieces. Oh, Jesus Christ, by the Emperor, do I have to do everything myself? It's so good. It was so good. This was the point when my opponent, when I roll the dice, I was like, oh, cool, there's 5 6s there. I get exploding 6s. That's 10 extra hits. And my opponent went, no, surely that's 5 extra hits. And I was like, no, he gets, for every 6, he gets 2 extra hits. And my opponent was like, no way. And I got the book out and showed him. He was like, that is insane. And then I rolled to wound. And he was like, what strength are you? I'm like, strength 7, so I'm wounding you on 2s. And he's like, no, if you're strength 7, I'm told 5, you're wounding me on 3s. I'm like, yeah, but like I said, Straken has got Frontline Combatant. It gives him a +1 to wound all the time. And my opponent was like, no way. And I showed him again. He was like, that's insane. How many points is he? I was like, he's 75 points. And my opponent was just like, no way. That's 75 points. He's better than my characters. And I was like, you're goddamn right he is. You're goddamn right he is. When the World Eater player involuntarily says that Straken outcorns the corn characters, you just walk away from that point. You have won the biggest moral victory. You have just got the high ground for eternity at that point. Then we go into turn number 3, and my opponent decides that it's time for a bit of a counterattack. He can't be shown up like that, not by some bloody guardsman. So in the north, he does his usual thing. A couple of unit berserkers appear, one from reserve, one from out the Rhino. They come in and they clear me off the objective. Same story that's been happening turn 1, turn 2, now happens again turn 3. In the south, though, that's where the fun happens. And he sends a unit of 8-bound and Lord Invocatus into my command squad. Now, one thing I should mention, I'm not sure how he did it, whether it was via like Blood Tithe or whether it was via a stratagem. But Straken had killed the 8-bound, but they had fought on death, which meant that Straken had died. He had taken, 3 and a bit 8-bound, essentially 4 8-bound with him, but he did die as a result of that. I think it was from Blood Tithe points, because my opponent had so many of them. He was like, I'm spending my Blood Tithe to get as many buffs up, because I know I'm just going to be spending, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. I'm just going to be spending 3 of them every turn to get the victory points. I was like, okay, yeah, that's fair enough. So going in against the command squad was the Lord Invocatus and a unit of Exalted 8-bound. And these guys are pretty nasty. Now, my opponent's plan was to use Lord Invocatus to just get through the Ogryn, because the Ogryn has a 4% vulnerable save, but Lord Invocatus ignores invuns. But the problem is, and this is basically my opponent's turn, by the way. This is the big thing that happens in it. But Lord Invocatus just messes it up. He misses with 2 of his attacks. He doesn't get any exploding 6s. And then when he wounds, he only gets because of transhuman, he only gets I think 3 3 wounds through in the end. And I end up making a bunch of feel no pain. So Lord Invocatus comes in and doesn't do any damage to me. I think he got 2 wounds through and I proceeded to roll a 5 and a 6 on my feel no pain. And he was like, okay, that's a bit annoying. His whole job was to kill that Ogryn. But it's fine. I've got 3 Exalted 8-bound. They are going to smash into pieces. So the Exalted 8-bound go in and they start swinging. And they've got exploding hits. And there's all this stuff happening. And then, but I've got Transhuman on. And Transhuman, it's very swingy, right? Because these guys are the Order of the Bastium Stellaris squad. And so he goes in. And he does 12 wounds to me. Now, bear in mind, these 12 wounds are all like damage 3, but they become damage 2 because of the Ogryn. And I've only got a 4% vulnerable save. And I have to slow roll these. I don't want to slow roll them. You guys know I'm not a big fan of slow rolling. Sometimes I do it to troll like Trooper Tom on the battle boards, but I actually don't like doing it. But I have to slow roll them because it says in the rules pack that like you have to slow roll if you want to use a command point. You can't roll them all and then go, oh, I'll use a command point on that one. They insist you slow roll them. So I have to slow roll these one at a time. And I go 4 up, and I go pass, 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 pass. I go 5 in a row before I fail one. I use my CP reroll, pass, pass. And so I've passed, I think it was 7 out of 12 before I failed one of these 4-ups. I fail the 4-up and it's 2 damage. I roll the feel no pains and I pass both of them. I roll the next invulnerable save and I fail it. I roll the feel no pains and I pass both of them. I roll the net, so that was it. That took me to 10. So there were 2 left, and I'm like, oh well, the Ogryn can't die now. So I roll both of them. I pass one. I fail one. I do the feel no pains, and I pass one of them. A unit of Exalted 8-bound went in and did 1 wound to the Dreadnork. Yes! It was so tanky! And for about 1 second, it was only a second, and I totally understood it, and I had no hard feelings whatsoever. For 1 second, my opponent, and it was literally, it could have even been half a second, my opponent got extremely tilted. And Ed, if you're watching this, by the way, I'm only giving you a hard time. I'm only pulling your leg here, by the way. He basically was like, that's fucking bullshit. That doesn't happen. And then he was like, and then he was over it. He was just over it. He just had this one moment where he just got very upset, and then he was just, and he's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. And I think the reason that he wasn't bothered by it, how he just, he was just annoyed by it more than anything else, was because it was abundantly obvious that this was his turn 3. It was abundantly obvious that he was probably going to win the game anyway, because he had managed to keep me off any primary. I'd only held 1 primary for the first 3 turns, which meant for turn 2, turn 3, I didn't get any primary points. And I'm scoring okay on my secondaries, but he's just doing, so he's getting all the primary he wants. He's maxed out most of his secondaries by turn 3. Any remaining points he picks up by turn 4. And so with this epic moment, essentially it doesn't really matter, unfortunately. And so what happens is, to sort of wrap the game up, my turn 3, I end up like clearing off the units that I can see, but my Leman Russes are really struggling to get any angles. And I end up, by the end of turn 3 and turn 4, my opponent is stoically refusing to charge my command squads. And he's literally just moving and advancing units onto objectives to deny me primary, because he's OBSEC, I'm not. And he just moves on to the objectives, denies me primary, and then dies and scores his points. And the last turn 4, turn 5, he doesn't actually do all that much charging. He doesn't actually do that much damage to me. He just literally yeets his remaining berserkers out, yeets his remaining 8-bound out. And by the end of the game, the end of turn 5, I've basically killed him down to like, I think it's just like a couple of spawn and some like straggler berserkers and a rhino. I've killed him down to quite a lot. But in return, he's been so aggressive, just move blocking me, charging me, going for the infantry squads. But by the end of the game, I basically got my 2 command squads left over, a smattering of infantry, and my tanks. So I've got way more left over than him, but he still manages to win the game. In fact, despite the fact he was killed down to what is essentially 2 spawn and a rhino, realistically, he maxes out 100 victory points, which is really, really impressive. And I get a very respectable, I get about like 80 points myself. I don't do too badly at all. That's a game-winning score in many, many games. But it was just the fact that the World Eaters could just afford to throw men out there, die, and they still scored points. And it was kind of a weird feeling. I couldn't really get angry at him because that's what Guard often does. Guard often throws the men out there to move block and to die and to get objectives and to deny victory points. But I think the difference between Guard doing it and World Eaters doing it is when my infantry go out there and move on to objective, I deny you primary. But when you kill my infantry, I don't get victory points for it. Whereas the World Eaters have that double dip where they're able to deny you primary and then they get their secondaries. And then if you try and deny them primary, they get their secondaries. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And I definitely think that the World Eaters, they probably need their secondaries toning down a little bit. You shouldn't be able to max out, or near as damn it max out, 3 secondaries by end of turn 3 for both players. That's a bit too strong in my opinion. But I don't want to take away the game from Ed, because let's be clear, he played his army perfectly. He really showed me what the World Eaters could do, and he did exactly the right thing. He traded perfectly. He went after objectives that he knew he could clear and then die on. He stoically refused to go anywhere near no man's land. He didn't take baits and get brought out into the open to then die. He didn't charge if he didn't need to. He charged when he knew it would get him points. So I just want to say, like, top fucking job, Ed. You played the World Eaters perfectly. It was like watching, someone, make the list, play to their tune and all that kind of stuff, dance to their tune. And overall, it was a very fun game. And I killed lots and lots, which is always good. And it was a great learning experience because I got the chance to see the World Eaters in action. So that was day number 1. And I had managed to win 1 game, but had lost 2. Now, normally, if I'd only managed to win 1 game on the first day, I might be a little bit disappointed. I might be like, right, okay, day 2, need to focus, need to get my game face on, want to make sure I do well, do the Guard community proud, all that kind of good stuff. But that wasn't the case here. I was absolutely buzzing because I had had so much fun on my first day. And I was really starting to feel like I was working the list out. I now had a lot more confidence in Straken. I knew that I could send him into almost anything and he was going to be able to beat it up or he was going to be able to tank the damage. Likewise, I'd got much better at judging what Marbo could take on. He wasn't quite as hefty as Straken, but he definitely could still punch well above his weight. And the command squads I now believe to be infallible. They could take on anything. They had tanked Wardens, 8-bound, and everything in between. So I was feeling pretty good about the list and I was feeling pretty good about the games I played, and I didn't really care if I won or lost. I just wanted to create more epic moments. I just wanted to see what else Straken could take on. He had taken the head of many a Khornate worshipper. He had taken the head of Khorne's favourite champion. And so my goal for day number 2 was simple. Let's keep the Straken hype train going. Let's see how big we can get this Straken bromance to be. And my goal was to send Straken into the biggest, baddest thing I could every single game. Let's really push this guy's limits. And as fate would have it, game number 4 presented many opportunities for the Bionic Man to heap glory upon himself, because I was taking on Lewis and his Grey Knights. Now, Grey Knights can be a tricky matchup for me, especially with this list. You see, they have lots of combat potential. Every man and their mum is packing a power weapon. And as we saw in game number 3, I can lock up 1 or 2 pretty chunky combat units. But if everyone's doing the old choppy to me, it can be a bit of a tricky one. Also, they've got great mortal wound output. And the one thing that can get through the Dreadnork fairly quickly, quicker than anything else, is mortal wounds. Because yes, I do a 5 up feel no pain, but that's not the same as transhuman and a 4-up infant and a 5 up feel no pain. So I was a little concerned I'm not going to lie, I was a little concerned. I thought this could potentially be a tricky matchup. Now, my opponent's list was kind of interesting. He had Calidor Drago, who is a beast, and then he had a Terminator Librarian equipped to do lots and lots of mortal wounds. He described him as the Mortal Wound Bomb Librarian. He then had a Tech Marine, and I believe that Tech Marine was there just to put +1 to hit on one of the Dread Knights. Speaking of Dread Knights, he had 3 of them, but he didn't have a Grand Master. First time that I've not faced a Nemesis Dread Knight Grandmaster in a while, and you definitely notice the difference when one's not in the list. But instead of the Grandmaster, he had taken 3 of the Baby Knights, the small knights with the double auto cannons. He also, in terms of infantry, had taken about 30 Grey Knight infantry. I believe they were all of the interceptors, the jumpy dudes, the teleporter guys. And I remember them all being the jumpy dudes because he said none of his Grey Knights had OBSEC. And that was really significant because I have a ton of OBSEC. And even when it comes to my command squads, I've got 6 people in each command squad because of the Ogryn Bodyguard. So if I'm sat on an objective and he charges into me with a 5-man unit, my command squad doesn't need to inflict any casualties. It just tanks all the damage on the Ogryn, and it still holds that objective. Now, the mission was secure missing artifacts, which is a 5-objective mission. You've got to hold 1 of them to start getting them primary points. It's actually the one where you can move the objectives around and you've got to do the priority objective, but that didn't really factor into the overall result, to be honest with you. Now, in terms of secondaries, I took Boots on the Ground, I took Inflexible Command, and of course I took Abhor the Witch. I have no psychics in my army, and all of those are actually pretty strong. It means that I should max Inflexible Command. Unless things go horribly wrong, I'm going to max Abhor the Witch. And Boots on the Ground is a relatively easy 10 points for me this game because I'm going to have at least infantry in 2 table quarters, and I can get a couple of command squads into the middle of the board. That's going to start racking me up some extra points as well. So I'm pretty confident that I've got a lot of secondary points in the bag, and it's going to come down to who can hold that middle objective and who can really smash it on the primary. Now, my opponent took for his secondaries Engage in all fronts, which is pretty good. He can teleport all over the place. Warp Ritual. I have no psychic powers, so unless I kill all the psychics, he's going to be doing that one. And then he took one I'd not seen before, which was Teleporter Assault. This was an easy 15 points. And my opponent was like, I've never failed to get 15 points this objective. And I can see why. If you have Gate of Infinity or Deep Strike, if you have come in from the warp somewhere and you kill a unit, you get 5 victory points. That's pretty spicy, especially when you're using a lot of Dread Knights and you've got all these mortal wounds flying around. That's a pretty spicy one, and it definitely made me think that there are a lot of factions out there, including Imperial Guard with Inflexible Command, don't get me wrong, that have access to an easy 15-point secondary objective. And I wonder if it is a game and design choice implemented by Games Workshop. But anyway, those are the objectives. Now let's crack on with the game. Now for deployment, you guys know what I'm going to say. Standard 3-line deployment. Tanks at the back, Hellhound on the flank. But this time I did go a little bit different, because this time I had my command squads basically on the front line. Not quite, just slightly back, but they were pretty far forward. And the reason I did that is I decided to try out a tactic. I decided that I wasn't going to have one command squad support one flank, one command squad support another flank, and Straken was going to go around being a bit of a lone wolf. I decided that both command squads and Straken were going to form a death ball, and they were just going to go straight for the center. And my thinking was that my opponent might be able to deal with one command squad, but being able to deal with both command squads and Straken, that's a pretty tall order. And as long as one of those banners is still flapping in the wind in the center of the board, I'm going to be getting lots of extra boots on the ground point. Now, my opponent, I think, makes a mistake in his deployment, because he decides to put a lot of his army in reserve. In fact, 2 Dread Knights go in reserve, half of the Interceptors go in reserve, and then he also puts the 3 Baby Knights in reserve as well. Now, the 3 Baby Knights do have a cool little trick where they can come in first turn from reserve, which is nice. It means that they can counter punch if he goes second, or you can have them come in later on if he wants to. But they're a really good way of being able to keep his main firepower off the board and protected. But the problem is, by putting so much in reserve, he started the game with relatively little table presence. And that meant that he didn't really have much ability to go on the offensive turn 1. He'd have to wait till turn 2, turn 3 to really start pulling out the big guns. But that gives me turn 1, the man with 110 infantry, the opportunity to really push him back. And things only get worse for my opponent and really sort of compound this issue when we roll to see who gets first turn. And I finally, for the first time in the event, managed to go first for once. And so naturally, upon sighting the enemy being mostly in deep strike, I advanced, sir. That's my style. So I had forward deployed my Ratlings fairly far forward just because I was like, well, that'll push him back. I don't really care if they die. And so I'd ensconced them in this little bit of cover behind these crates, and apparently the crates weren't breachable, so it meant they were actually quite difficult to get a long charge off on. And then I just moved 3, 4, I think it was 3 infantry squads, 3 Captain Juggle fighter squads, just moved those as far forward as I could. Just went hell for leather and really pushed them out. Didn't care where they ended up as long as they went as far as possible and they spread out as much as possible. And I also moved and advanced my Command Squad and Straken Death Ball close to the centre ball, but I couldn't quite get to it turn 1. But that was fine because I didn't need to, because you can't score boots to the ground first turn anyway, whether it's the flag or not. So that was my general infantry movement. Of course, behind that first sacrificial wave, I had the rest of my infantry coming up. But I had been quite clever with the way that I had deployed my infantry, the way that I had moved my infantry, I should say, because I moved them so that they were completely out in the open. If my opponent wanted to kill them in close combat or kill them with shooting, he was going to have to draw a direct line of sight to them, and they were so out in the open that he was going to have to basically expose himself in order to get any kills. Speaking of exposing units, I actually laid a trap for my opponent as well. Not only had I baited him out with the infantry, but that was more of just a general screen. I had fully baited and trapped one of my Leman Russes. It was an El Clasico tank, and I just put it right down a flank out in the open. And I knew that his baby knights would come in turn 1. And I knew that my opponent wouldn't be able to resist being able to pick up one of my main battle tanks early on. But I had done it in such a way that there was only one place that my opponent would be able to come on his board edge and shoot my Leman Russ. He had to come right on what would be his far left flank. And I had my Leman Russes in a position where this one spot that he could bring his knights on, I would be able to cover with my 3 other Leman Russes. So with the screen in place, the infantry advancing forward, and the trap baited, it went over to my opponent's turn 1. And he took it. He brought his 3 baby knights on, and they unloaded everything into my Leman Russ. But I had 4 CP in the bank at this point, so I just went ablative plating and smokescreen. And that meant that his knights, which didn't have the hunter's mark, whichever one it is that gives you +1 to hit against vehicles, were hitting on 4s, they were wounding on 5s, and yeah, they're AP -2, but I'm on a 4-up save. And yeah, they're like damage 3, but they become damage 2. And once he had blazed away with all these autocannons, all the tracer rounds popping off, pinging into my front armor, the total damage that he did was 2 wounds. Barely even scratched the paint. And this was a really, really bad position for my opponent to be in. Because if he had fallen for the trap, and I think he knew it was a bit of a bait for him, but if he had fallen for it, but at least taken a Russ out of the equation, then it wouldn't have been so bad. But now he's gone for the trap, and he's not even damaged or degraded a Leman Russ. Not that it would have mattered if he had degraded it. I've got Relentless, I can act on top profile. But he's not even destroyed the bait unit, which now means that he's going to have to get into a pretty one-sided firefight with a bunch of Leman Russes. Leman Russes which are going to be hitting him on 3s, wounding him on 3s, and the best he can do is rotate ion shields on one of his knights. That's it. Elsewhere in my opponent's turn 1, he decides to start clearing the screen of infantry, which is a pretty smart move for him. So the Dread Knight, which he had deployed on the board at the beginning of the game, he used Gate of Infinity to take it off it was hiding behind his backfield objective and the line of sight blocking L-shaped ruin. He teleported that And he moved it over to the similar flank that the Knights was on, but it couldn't quite draw line of sight to one of the Leman Russes because of how I'd screened him out. And it basically unloaded into a squad of infantry and killed it. So the Dread Knight went out to squad of infantry. I know it doesn't seem like a great trade, but I didn't really have anything that could threaten his Dread Knight that turn. So it was essentially a free kill for it to pick it up. He also went after another infantry squad on the flank with one of his 5-man intercept squads. They just moved forward, bolted it, charged it, finished it off, which was pretty cool. And then in the center of the board, I did have a move squad that I got onto the middle objective, and Calador Drago and the Librarian moved forward, and between their shooting and mortals and just general close combat, they cleared that 10-man squad up pretty quickly. So my initial wave of 30 guys had died, but that's fine, because I've still got 80 blokes in the bank. It then comes around to turn number 2, and Sly Marbo wins me the game in a single maneuver. I kid you not, boys. Sly Marbo earned his keep this game. So what happened in turn number 2? I moved my Straken Dreadnork Deathball into the middle of the board, ready to take on Calador Drago and the Terminate Librarian. I moved my Leman Russes in a position so they've all got line of sight on the Baby Knights. I use my Bane Wolf and get that into position so it's covering those 5 Strike Marines that were bothering me up north. And I drop Marbo down behind enemy lines because my opponent had just left his Tech Marine guarding his home field objective. I did say to him, are you sure you don't want to reposition something? It's not too late. You could easily have just deployed this squad here instead. It's fine. And my opponent went, no, I've got plans for the squad. I'm pretty certain the Tech Marine will be fine. I mean, he's on a 2-up save in cover and all this kind of stuff. And I did explain to my opponent, my guy does 2 damage and he does ignore cover and so on and so forth. But my opponent's like, no, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's just like one guy. It'll be all right. Oh, how little did he know. Oh, how little. I think, to be honest, he wasn't being ignorant. He was just like, well, I've made the mistake. I'll just have to live with it, which is actually a pretty respectable position for him to have. Now, Marbo drops down. He levels that Angron Demon Primarch killing Uzi at the Tech Marine, and he unleashes a good burst. Now, even though the Tech Marine is on a 2-up save in cover, Marbo ignores cover because of veteran Guerrillas. He's well within 18 inches. And he also is AP -2, 2 damage. So suddenly this guy that's on a comfortable 2-up save is actually on a 4-up save. And Marbo is able to sneak a wound past doing 2 damage to Tech Marine. It's at this point that my opponent reveals that it's not a Primaris Tech Marine. It's a regular ass Tech Marine. So it only has like 4 wounds or something silly. Marbo then goes for the charge. Of course, there's other things that happen in turn. We'll come back to the other bits of shooting and stuff in a moment. But Marbo then goes for the charge, and he makes it on a double 6. He doesn't even need the reroll. And he goes in with his 5 attacks. He gets 4 hits. He gets 3 wounds. And my opponent fails every single one of them. Even with the CP reroll, it would not have made a difference. And Marbo guts the Tech Marine where he stands, cleans the blood off his knife on his trouser leg, and then he melts back into the shadows. Now, at this point, it's not immediately obvious to me the impact that Marbo is going to have on the game. He's dropped in, he's killed a character, it's an epic moment, another kill wrapped up onto the tally, but it's just a Tech Marine who had kind of done his job of giving +1 to hit to one of the Dread Knights, right? Yeah, my opponent's going to have to send something back to that objective, but it's not such a big deal. But actually it is, because it means that my opponent, who's relatively limited anyway, he's only got 3 Dread Knights and 30 infantry, now is going to have to direct some pretty serious forces to holding his backfield objectives. Because if he just puts 5 Marines on that objective, Marbo has a decent chance of picking them all up. Because he can drop in, every single shot that he does, every single knife swing that he does is damage 2. So it's not out of the realms of possibility that if my opponent just drops in 5 Marines, Marbo is going to come in and just kill them. Shoot a couple to death, charge him, finish 3 off. He can do that, and my opponent's back to square one. So what it means my opponent has to do, and we are skipping ahead slightly here, but what my opponent has to do is he has to take 10 of his interceptors and put them on his backfield objective. That's a third of his infantry just taken out of the game. Even if it's just for a turn, whilst he waits for Marbo to reappear, it still allows me to put a lot more pressure onto him, and it stops my opponent having the weight of numbers and the number of strike marines that he needs to be able to push forward and actually take the fight to me. Interestingly, my opponent also takes the decision to put one of his Dread Knights on another objective, one that was on his side of the board in sort of the bottom right hand corner. And the reason he does that is because, again, there was only 5 marines holding it, and he needs to make sure that turn 3 I don't just pop Marbo up again and take him off another primary. Now, elsewhere in my turn 2, things don't get much better for my opponent. I end up blasting all of his baby knights off the table with my Leman Russes. Rotate Iron Shields just isn't enough to save him, and the fact that I'm flat damage 3 on all of my weapons just is not an ideal situation for him. So I easily blast his knights to the table, and then Straken and the command squads make it into Calador Drago. Now, my opponent doesn't have the CP to interrupt at this point, so I go first with one of my command squads. The Ogryns managed to bonk a couple of wounds off Calador Drago. I think they managed to get 4 wounds off him. And then Straken goes, and he didn't even need the help from the Ogryns. He goes absolutely ballistic, does the classic Straken, gets 3 6s on his hits, doesn't get any 1s, wounds with everything because he wounds Drago on 2s, thanks to +1 to wound. And Drago just fails 3 or 4 of those precious, juicy 3+ invulnerable saves. And the Grandmaster of the Grey Knights falls to Straken's Bionic Arm and Devil's Claw. Another Warlord added to the tally. Another character sent back to the abyss. These Grey Knights, they ain't so tough. Don't know why we bother keeping them a secret. It's not worth the effort. That's what Straken thinks. And then finally in the north, I am able to melt another squad of his marines with the Bane Wolf. This thing just consistently just burned to death and melted 5 marines every single turn. So going into round number 2 for my opponent, bear in mind my opponent's literally only had 1 turn at this point. He has lost 10 of his marines, he has lost all of his baby knights, and he's just lost Calador Drago. He has got 10 marines that are out of the game for a turn because they're having to hold the backfield objective. And he's got a Dread Knight and another 5 marines that are also out of the game. This means that my opponent's total offensive output for his turn is 2 Dread Knights and 5 marines and a single Terminator Librarian. I mean, it's all of that going up against my entire army. I mean, it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter what unit you're running. That equation does not add up. And so my opponent drops in his 2 Dread Knights, but they have to stay pretty far away from me because of the screening infantry. Those 2 Dread Knights are able to pick up a couple of infantry squads, the ones that were screening them out. That's it. Remember, one of them's just sat on an objective this turn because it has to be because of Marbo. And the Librarian does Warp Ritual because he's like, well, I might as well get some points on that. And he has these 5 Marines that are able to come at me, and they go into my Bane Wolf, but they fail to kill it. And so at the end of my opponent's turn 2, all he's killed is 20 infantry and he's slightly injured a tank. I mean, it's not really enough to write home about. Turn 3 comes around and I seal the deal. I pick up the infantry that are in combat with the Bane Wolf, between the Bane Wolf shooting and a couple of fixed bayonets. Cadian Jungle Fighter squads going in there, doing their business. And then the Straken Death Ball beats the crap out of the Librarian. That realistically takes out his last chance of being able to do Warp Ritual, because I'm just going to sit on that objective now and screen him out and keep him from getting anywhere near it with other things. Even his Dread Knights aren't going to do anything to me. Straken will take a Dread Knight given the chance. And then I'm also able to use Marbo to drop in. And Marbo actually does end up dropping in. And between like shooting and charging, he does manage to finish off 5 of the Grey Knight Marines. But then the remaining 5 kill him. But that's another load of infantry taken out of the fights. My opponent, end of my turn 3, is just down to 10 Strike Marines and 3 Dread Knights. I think I'd even managed to start doing some work on the Dread Knights as well. I ended up throwing loads and loads of shots into one of them and almost taken it out with my Leman Russes. Yeah, it was over. And my opponent says, let's just call it. He doesn't even do his turn 3. He knows it's not going to make a difference. So yeah, a pretty big win for the Guard in game number 4. But it was definitely not time to rest on my laurels, because I had now won 2 games. I had lost 2 games. And so the final game meant it was all to play for. Was I going to walk away with a positive win rate, or was I going to walk away with a negative one? And lo, we get to the final game. And the spicy gods of fate were not yet done with me, because I ended up going into possibly one of the worst matchups I could have in the entire of Warhammer 40k. Bear in mind, I don't have Born Soldiers, so I don't have auto wounds, and I end up going into 50 Dark Angel Terminators. 30 of them legit Deathwing with all of the Storm Shields and Thunder Hammers and Cyclone Missile launchers you could shake a stick at. And another 20 of them being just basic Space Marine Terminators. But hell, they're in a Dark Angel Deathwing Detachment, so they all have permanent transhuman. Straken +1 to wound, doesn't matter. Baymolf hitting on 2 pluses, wounding on 2 pluses, I have to say, doesn't matter. None of it matters. I don't have Born Soldiers. I'm in a really, really difficult position. Now, this list was being run by a good friend of mine called Marcus. And before you all start throwing disparaging remarks down in the comment section, yeah, I'm looking at you there, yeah, press the backspace, you know, before you post that comment. It's actually a really cool army. The full thing is an Astral Claws themed force, and he's gone the extra mile with the paint scheme and all of the other bits and bobs as well. So it's really, really cool. And who amongst us hasn't dreamed of fielding or fighting alongside or facing off against a full Terminator force? But Marcus decided he wasn't going to let his memes be dreams, and he was going to make this army a reality. And if you're going to do it, now is the time. Am I right? I mean, Dark Angels are doing really well at the moment. Deathwing in particular are having a fantastic time. So if you've got the Terminators already, why not give them a spin? Quick side note here, I was chatting to Marcus about this list during and after the event, and he said that it was actually designed for teams tournaments rather than a singles one, but he was just getting some practice with it. The reason this list is so good in a teams format is because no matter what the opposing team has in their lineup, they might have players with some of the gnarliest, most horrible things. You can send this list into it, and more than likely it's going to come out with a minor loss at worst, and maybe even just a straight up draw. That's really good in a team's format, because you often do need someone who can be chucked under the bus each round, and often it means they get chucked under the bus and they lose. Maybe they get 1 or 2 tournament points for their team. But if you've got a list that you can chuck under the bus and it comes back and says, guys, I got a draw, that's incredibly valuable in a team's format. But getting back to the game, the mission was Death and Zeal, which is a 5 objective mission with table quarter deployment. And for secondaries, I ended up taking Retrieve Data and Boots on the Ground and Inflexible Command. Now, we know what Inflexible Command does. We know my thinking behind Boots on the Ground. I'm going to get those command squads into the center of the board. But the reason I took Retrieve Data is because Marcus has got 50 models, but they kind of need to form into a giant death ball and march across the board. And that means he's actually got pretty low screening. And so I thought that I could put a unit of Cadian Jungle Fighters or infantry in reserve, bring them in turn 2 or turn 3, and retrieve dem datas. Marcus ended up going for banners. Naturally, he thought he's just going to walk on to the 3 middle objectives, sit on them the whole game, and just sit there raising banners with all his OBSEC Terminators. He also went for Oath of Moment. Again, just sit in the middle of the board and don't run away. Will get you 3 victory points every single turn, because you get a victory point for not running away, and you get 2 victory points for sitting in the middle of the board. And then he also went for Shock Tactics, because he figured that he would be able to drive me off an objective most turns, and that would get him the 4 points that he needs. For deployment, I'm going to give you all one guess what my deployment was. Hint, it didn't change. And then for Mark's deployment, it was pretty straightforward. 40 Marines in a giant death ball at the edge of his deployment zone, ready to march across the map and move on to the 3 middle objectives. He did split up one of his squads into 2 5-man units so that he could have 5 sitting on his home objective and 5 joining the main death ball. But that was basically it. Now, nature ends up reasserting itself, and I lose the roll off for turn 1. I actually really wanted it because I had a cunning plan, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. Now, Marcus ends up just moving forward. He does try an advance roll here and there, but he ends up rolling relatively low, and his first turn is just these Terminators slowly, inexorably just marching forward and firing off a few shots here and there. Not a huge amount to write home about. He doesn't quite make it into the center of the board for Oath of Moment. And then it comes over to me. And then I begin Operation Annoy the Marines to Death. Because what I decide to do is not kill them, but slow them down. You see, I've worked out pretty quickly that if I try my usual tactic of blowing them off the board, it's not going to work. I struggled to blow the Custodes off the board, and I was wounding them on 3s, and there was less of them. I'm now trying to do the same thing against these Terminators, which have got double the amount of infantry coming towards me. Oh, and yeah, they're all transhuman. So I decide the best thing I need to do is just keep Marcus off those objectives for as long as possible. Slow him down. And so when it comes to my orders, pretty much all of my infantry squads, bar 2 or 3, end up getting suppressive fire, and my tanks all get pinning fire. Now, if you're not familiar with what these orders do, suppressive fire means if you get 5 hits on an enemy unit, it gets -1 to hit. That's shooting and combat. And pinning fire from the tanks means that if you get 5 hits, then you give the enemy unit a -2 movement modifier. That means the Marines go down to moving only 3 inches a turn with those Terminators. That is massive. So I managed to successfully pin down the 3 blocks of Terminators that are actually going to be coming towards me. Bear in mind, I know 1 block of 10 is just going to sit on the middle of the board, just getting Oath of Moment. Now, the amount of damage I do is inconsequential. I think I kill 3 Terminators, but he's got an Apothecary, so the end result is I kill 2 of them, right? And it goes over to Marcus's turn 2, and he has to move and advance with the majority of his units. Because if he doesn't advance, he's not going to make it onto the objectives. Physically won't make it on. So he has to move and advance. This again cuts down the amount of shooting he can do. And the shooting he can do has all got a -1 to hit modifier. So his damage output is incredibly low. And I think one of my Lehman Russes ends up taking a couple of cracked rockets and takes like 3 wounds. It's really not a big deal. And the rest of my infantry, I think I lose a couple of infantry squads overall at this point, but it's not a huge amount whatsoever. The big thing is, by forcing Marcus to advance with the majority of his Marines, it means that he's actually able to raise very few banners. We are going into what will be his turn 3, and he won't have any banners raised, apart from like 1 in the center of the board and 1 at the back. At this point, he realistically wants to have like 4 banners raised and 10 to 20 Terminators defending each one of those banners, but he's not been able to do that. So that's his turn 2. It comes over to my turn 2, and I'm like, right, well, we need to continue Operation Slow him down. If I can delay him for another turn, this is going to be really, really big. So I also need to make sure he's, again, not going to raise those banners up. So I do the pinning again, I do the suppressive fire again, but this time I also put loads of infantry on the objectives. I put at least 15 infantry on each of the objectives that are going to be contested. I don't go to any of the center one. I know I'm not going to be able to do that. And so what this means is that he is able to move on to the objective. He's not able to raise his banners. He can move and he can charge me at this point, and he's going to be having a great time. So I am going to take a lot of casualties turn 3, and I accept that. But I also know that he is really going to be struggling for points. Bear in mind that I am now racking up boots. Bear in mind I am retrieving data. Bear in mind I am inflexible commanding. I'm doing fine on primary. I've managed to hold on to 1 or 2 throughout the game. And I'm doing absolutely fine also on my secondaries. Getting into Marcus's turn 3, and the game finally starts heating up. He is able to start putting pressure on me. He moves, he shoots, he charges, and by the end of his turn, he has successfully cleared the flank objectives and the middle objectives, and he is holding them with a decent amount of Terminators. But the thing is, he's not been able to move wholly onto the objective. The way I've been move blocking him and the way I've been putting my infantry on there basically means that he's able to get about 5 Terminators onto each objective. Even if one of those squads is a 10-man block, not all of them have made it on. This means at the beginning of my turn, sure, I'm not going to get that much primary, but it also means I can just move 6, 7 guardsmen on really easy. I got small little 25mm bases, so I just move on to the objectives, and it means that, oh look, Marcus, you're not getting any primary either. And so that's what I do. But at the same time, remember, I'm not only denying him significant primary, I'm also denying him banner points, because he can't raise a banner on those objectives if he doesn't control them. But it's not all sunshine and roses for the guard. I'm actually struggling on primary myself, because whilst I'm able to deny Marcus those mid-board objectives, he's clearing them off me every single turn as well, which means I'm basically starting the game with one primary objective most turns. Occasionally I am able to sneak it so I get an extra objective which gets me the 8 points, but by and large I'm scoring about 4 primary most of the game. And Marcus by and large is scoring 8. Because he is able to hold those 2 objectives. The one in the centre, he just plonked 10 Terminators on that I can't get anywhere near, and his backfield one. I decide that I need to disrupt this flow of primary. It's going to be key to me trying to eke some kind of result out of this game. So what I do is turn 2, I had dropped in Marbo and he'd gunned a Terminator down and then he'd run away. This is on Marcus's backfield objective. And then turn 3, he drops down and he guns another Terminator down. He then charges in but isn't able to do enough damage to kill. I think he kills another Terminator, but that's basically it. That means there's about 2 Terminators guarding Marcus's backfield objective. Now, in my turn 2, the squad that I'd put in reserve to retrieve data had come in and they retrieved data, but they were within 12 inches of Marcus's home objective. And so what I do is I end up using a Voxcast 24-inch range. I do move and move, and I'm able to get 3 infantry onto Marcus's backfield objective. This tears the banner down, and it also means that he won't be able to get the primary for that turn. And so he's only getting 4 primary points for holding the middle objective going into his turn 4. Now, elsewhere in my turn 3, I switch from doing Operation Slow Them Down to Operation Okay, we need to actually start doing some damage now. This is where I just go reroll 1s to hit on people, take aim, and I actually start doing some pretty decent damage to the Terminators. One of the objectives up north that had 10 Deathwing on it, I kill them down to about half. This forces Marcus to redirect another 10-man block, one that had been marching straight towards my home objective. It has to redirect and go north instead. And in terms of my firepower this turn, I actually put most of it in the Terminators that are advancing onto the southern objective. And I clear them off. Just the 5 Terminators that were messing around there, I clear them off. And that means that going for the rest of the game, I actually have 2 objectives that are pretty much in my possession. I've got my home one, and I've got the one that is in the bottom right of the map from my perspective. This is really good because it gives me a staple primary point income. I had been struggling to get about 4 points a turn at that point, but now I was going to get 8 for the rest of the game, which is pretty nice. Going into turn 4, turn 5, it's actually pretty straightforward. Marcus essentially clears off his backfield objective and finally secures that. He clears off the northern objective and secures that. And of course, he just continues sitting on the middle objective as well. My command squads this whole time, by the way, had been basically tying up one of these big 10-man blocks of Terminators, and they just taken it out of the game. Between them and Straken, that Terminator block didn't get anywhere. And Straken's count this game, by the way, was 3 Deathwing Terminators. My turn 4, turn 5 consist of me denying Marcus the ability to get 12 primary turn 5. I just yeet a few infantry onto the top objective. That's part of how he clears me off. So he's not able to get 12 primary points in turn 5. And then I just sit on my 2 primary points in my turns 4, turns 5, just getting my lovely 8 primary points. And I'm also there just claiming all of the data. I fully max out data. I also max out on boots to the ground because the command squads, the squad Terminators they've been tying up, was near enough to the centre of the board that I was able to make sure that I had a banner nearby. And then I also end up getting max and flexible command. Of course, you know, it's an easy 15, that one. And so we get to the end of the game and I start tossing the points up. Now, Marcus gets slightly more primary than me because he was able to hold 2 objectives for 3 turns of the game rather than me just holding them for 2 turns of the game. And he was also able to get a few extra points on the tertiary bit as well. So he's slightly ahead on primary, but not by much, slightly ahead. But on secondaries, I'm slightly ahead because I've maxed out all of my secondaries, but Marcus has completely buggered it on banners. I think he walked away from that game with 5, maybe 6 banner points. It wasn't a lot whatsoever. But he does max out shock tactics. He doesn't quite max out Oath. He does pretty well, but he doesn't quite max out Oath at the moment. But we put everything together, we checked the score, we double checked it, and the end result was 82 points to the Space Marines and 82 points to the Imperial Guard. A dead draw. A draw by normal 40k standards and a draw by WTC standards. And honestly, it was the best way to end the event. I had a proper cerebral game. It was the only game that actually felt like a really proper game. It wasn't just like, oh, this is a good matchup, this is a bad matchup. I had to think really properly. I had to do all the strategy, all the good tactics, and it was a fantastic game against a different list and against a good friend. And at the end of the day, we were both able to walk away with our heads held high because we managed to get a draw. Could not have asked for a more perfect ending to the event. And so we get to the end of day 2 and the end of the event. 5 games of competitive 40k in one of the sharkiest of tanks, and my fluffy, memey Catachan close combat list had managed to come away with 2 victories, 2 losses, and a straight up draw. Not a bad result if I do say so myself. And to close out today's episode, I want to go over some final thoughts and a bit of a summary. First thing I want to mention is how much fun I had with the Combat Guard army. It just felt so cool to run around and punch things with guardsmen. When it came down to a couple of Cadian squads pulling down a few Grey Knights and beating them up, or Straken going in there, winding up his bionic arm, every single time I pulled off a charge, it definitely seemed to go my way. And that's something that I can't say I've ever really felt with Guard before. Normally when I'm running my Guard, I have to sort of do this fighting retreat for the first couple of turns and then try and pull it back turns 3, turns 4, turns 5. But in this game, I was able to confidently march forward, knowing that I was able to absorb the charges from the enemy on my command squads, and then Straken was able to go in there, and maybe a few infantry squads would go in there as well, and they would be able to push the enemy back. Speaking of the command squads, the Dreadnorks proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are one of the most durable units in the entire of Warhammer 40k. They took everything from 8-bound, Exalted, Custodes, Grey Knights, and Deathwing Terminators, and they absorbed it all. Their damage output was relatively low. Occasionally, the Ogryn Bodyguard would bonk someone on the head and send them to sleep. Occasionally, the power swords would come out and do a wound, but they just stopped everything dead in their tracks. And they actually developed a bit of a reputation over the course of the event. Because it was only a 30-35 man event, it was a little bit more interactive, a little bit more personal. And so I had people coming up to me, especially on day 2, going, oh, how did your last game go? What did the Dreadnorks annoy this time? But if the Dreadnought struggled to do any damage, Straken was always there to pick up the slack. The man was an absolute weapon. Anything I sent him into, he annihilated. And he honestly was just the hero of the tournament. It was just so cool seeing this bionic man, the million credit colonel, just going into anything from Khorne Berserkers all the way up to the leader of the Grey Knights, and just knocking the daylights out of them, just sending them back to from whence they came. It was brilliant. And Marbo was no slouch either. He may not have gone in and done that massive spike of damage that Straken did, but he racked up a pretty impressive tally of kills, and his damage tended to be a little bit more subtle. He would come in, kill something with shooting, pop away, come in, kill something with shooting, and then get a little bit more damage in the combat phase as well. But there was never a game where he failed to achieve something. And I think I'd like to end today's video by going through the combined kill tallies of Straken and Marbo. So starting off with Straken, he killed over the course of this event 3 Exalted 8-bound, 3 regular 8-bound, Khan the Betrayer in solo combat, Drago in solo combat, Terminator Librarian in solo combat, and 3 Deathwing Terminators. I think he actually killed 5, but they kept getting back up from the Apothecary, so I balanced it out as saying 3. He also tanked a full round of combat from Trajan in a single solo mano-a-mano duel, and he was also able to tank a full round of combat from 3 Deathwing Terminators. Not bad for a 75-point senior officer. We then had Marbo. He racked up an impressive 2 Custodes Wardens, 2 8-bound, a Tech Marine, and 2 Deathwing Terminators, but his most impressive kill was absolutely Angron, the Demon Primarch of the World Eaters. All I'm going to say is, they don't call him the one-man army for nothing. And on that note, let's wrap up this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, make sure you smash that like button like Straken smashes his foes to pieces, and also press the subscribe button to never miss an episode. If you have found today's video particularly fun and interesting, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. It really does make a big difference, and it allows me to go to more tournaments and make more of these kind of videos. Also, by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter, you will gain access to the Morning Glory Discord, which is an online community of over 1,000 active members. It's really exploded in popularity over the last 6 months, and it's always popping off in there. We've got loads of different channels to discuss things like tournaments, like painting, hobbying, tactics, armaments, all the different aspects of Warhammer 40k. And of course, I want to say a big thank you and a shout out to all of the current channel members and Patreon supporters. Your generous support is truly the lifeblood of the channel, and it's entirely what makes this kind of video possible. But that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.